Below is your story with added punctuation and formatting to make it more engaging for narration. My father told me a story once, and I'll never forget it. For a few reasons. I think it's the first real story he ever told me as a child, not some bedtime fable or an embellished memory. It was also the story of how my grandfather died. But honestly, that isn't the main reason it sticks with me. You hear stories on TV, or sometimes you just overhear something in a public place. People talk about ghosts, or aliens, or some kind of strange beast. And you think to yourself, that isn't real. They're making it up, or they're mistaken, or they're just crazy. It's a natural, almost instinctual disbelief. You can't believe it until something happens. Something that brings it all together, connects the dots in a way you never thought of before. Maybe it happens to you, or maybe you hear the same terrifying story again and again, happening to different people, in different places, across different eras. It doesn't take long for the world to become a bit bigger than you thought. A lot more dangerous, too. As I said, this is a story my father told me, but I never believed it, even though he swore up and down that it was true. It wasn't until I started clicking around on the internet, years later, that I started to believe. I began to hear other stories, just like the one my father told me. The details were different, the setting, the names, but the core elements were identical. The way the creature looked, the sounds it made, its horrific M.O. It didn't take me long to believe in the rake. That's not what my father called it, of course. He'd never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know what the consensus has taken to naming it. When he chose to call it something other than it or that thing, he called it a skinwalker. A name. He explained, from an old Navajo tale his grandfather had told him. A name for something not quite man and not quite beast. A monster that could wear the skin of an animal, or a person, to hide what it truly was. He always said, "Son, some things aren't just animals. They have a kind of intelligence, a malevolent sort." So, I'll tell you the story the way he told it to me. We were out hunting one night, killing coyotes for $50 a skin. This was back in Ohio, where we lived on a dairy farm. We did it almost every night because we desperately needed the money. Sometimes, while we were out, we'd come upon a deer and kill it. Our landlord didn't mind, and it could feed our family for a few nights, saving us some cash. You learn to appreciate those small victories when you're poor. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home, walking, because we didn't have a car or a four-wheeler back then. We cut through the woods, a path we knew by heart, and that's when we came upon it. Blood, everywhere, splattered on the trees and the grass and the creek. At first, we figured it was a pack of coyotes. We'd seen them sometimes. They'd scavenge, then start hunting deer or even cattle. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs and became even more vicious and unpredictable. But this wasn't like that. When a pack of dogs or wolves or coyotes attack something, they do it right. It's a clean, efficient kill. They'll pick off one that's weak, sick, old, or just small. They'll hunt it, draw it into a corner someplace it can't get out of, and then they'll run it right to the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see that alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. It'll just notice that its throat is gone, and then it will drop dead. It's quick. It's clean. That wasn't what happened here. Something had run up on a den of deer. Coyotes won't attack a den, and wolves neither, because they'd get too much of a fight. There were three, I think, 3 bodies just torn apart. A head here, a leg there, a torso over there. It was pure chaos. A scene of raw, mindless violence. Predators don't do that. They don't leave behind scraps. Whatever had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. for a kind of sick, twisted sport. But we didn't know that. We saw a bunch of carcasses, and we just thought, this is something we've got to take care of. A wild animal, perhaps a rabid dog, something that needed to be put down. I remember my dad telling me to go home. He thought it was a pack of feral dogs, and he didn't want me around for the inevitable fight. But I wasn't leaving him, and I damn sure wasn't walking through 2 miles of woods alone with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. I was only 13 at the time, so a .22 rifle was about the only gun I could reliably use. Dad had the shotgun, and he wasn't going anywhere without it. It took me a while to convince him, but finally, we began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't hard, either. We just followed the blood. Either that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. The trail was a dark, glistening line on the forest floor, a morbid breadcrumb trail left just for us. I know that I'd never seen my dad scared before that night. Not even when he came back from the war, and he'd seen some things that would make a sane man's blood run cold. But this was different. He was quiet. His shoulders were tense, and his grip on the shotgun was white-knuckled. We started hearing noises. I've been in a lot of woods in my life, all over the world, but I ain't never heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. Not the scream of a fox in a trap, or a rabbit caught by an owl. It was a deep, terrified screaming. Fox, rabbits, raccoons, and birds, all of them just scared out of their minds. Now, keep in mind this is maybe 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning. Except for the fox and some owls, nothing was supposed to be awake. But they weren't just awake, they were moving. I saw flocks of birds that night fly straight into trees, just trying to get out of there. I heard the frantic rustling of squirrels and raccoons through the underbrush, their tiny lives consumed by a single, overriding panic. It was the sound of primal terror, a panic that had overridden every natural instinct for self-preservation. We came upon a pack of coyotes and nearly shot a couple, thinking that it was what we were looking for. But then, we saw that they were running toward us. They ran right past us, didn't even notice we were there, their eyes wide and their tails tucked low. And then some deer did the same. And then some rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even a couple of wild hogs. Oh, these things were supposed to be eating each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting out of there. Oh, we should have put it together then. We should have realized that whatever we were tracking wasn't something we were supposed to see, and it definitely wasn't something we could kill. We were the only two things in the forest stupid enough to be walking toward the danger. I don't know why we didn't just go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature, to go toward trouble, to fight. And knowing what I knew about what my father did during the war, my nature was to stay close to him. He was my protector, my rock, and I trusted him more than anything. We finally get into an open valley. It was normally a soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. We saw the tracks then. A lot of the animals fleeing the forest had paved over the land, but where the deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step. It was a perfect, clean trail, like the fleeing animals were leaving it for us to find. A deliberate path. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighing around 40 pounds nearly tore my damn throat out once, and all that means is that it's quick, and it's hard to hit. So we followed the tracks, and it didn't take long for us to find where it was. There was this old schoolhouse that sat on the top of the hill. Half of it had been ripped up by a tornado, and nobody lived there, not for a long time. We'd caught homeless people in there sometimes, or druggies looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was just some sick kid riding a high. But we didn't think that for long. We get within 50 yards and we hear this noise, a screeching kind of sound. It was sort of made up of two different sounds. One, a high-pitched screech. Another was a low-pitched growl. It was making both at the same time, a duet of madness that scraped against your sanity. We get within 20 yards of the schoolhouse and the sound intensifies. I can remember thinking that it sounded like paper being torn apart while someone was swinging water in a bucket back and forth. It was a wet, tearing sound combined with a shrill, manic squeal, and it was constant, and it get buzz. My dad looks at me, kneels down, and whispers, "I gotta stay behind him, 'cause we're about to corner him. Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially a predator." But we could tell by the tracks that it was just one. He tells me it's probably a single feral dog, probably rabid. The plan was simple, the plan we always had. Sneak up on it while it was eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting until it didn't move anymore. Then slit its throat just to be sure. If it gets to Dad, it's my job to shoot it or stab it, whatever it takes to get it off of him. So he walks up, and I'm right behind him, just a tad to his side so I can see what it is. I wish to this day that I hadn't. It was leaning over a carcass, tearing off its flesh and throwing what it didn't want at its side. There was blood all over the old brick, glistening in the moonlight. The thing was pale white, human-looking, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like a person, but it sat like a monkey, hunched over the kill. Its hands weren't normal. They had long, skeletal fingers with claws at the end, like shards of obsidian. So we see that, and my dad hesitates. He wasn't about to fire on a person, no matter how much they looked like a monster. He clears his throat to try to get it to turn around, to see if he could reason with it, maybe scare it off. A terrible, fatal mistake. I swear to God, all the noise just ceased. I ain't never heard true silence before that, and not after it. Not the kind of silence you get in a quiet room, but a vacuum of sound. The screeching from the schoolhouse, the rustling of the scared animals in the distance, even the chirping of the crickets. It all just stopped. For 2 seconds, nothing. Nothing made any noise. It was the complete absence of sound, and it was horrifying, which made it all the louder when it finally turned around. It made this shrill cry, a sound of pure hatred and malice. And then it jumped on Dad. He got a shot off. I think he missed it. If he hit the thing, it didn't mind. It was on him, tearing parts of him off. I started shooting it with my .22, point blank, but it barely bled. The rounds just seemed to sink into its skin without doing any real damage. I got off 5 rounds, and then I started hitting it with the gun butt. It wasn't budging. It didn't even register that I was there. It was completely focused on my dad, its claws tearing at him, taking off bits of his flesh. It started on his torso, ripping off the skin, and then it moved up. It tore off his throat, his nose, his eyes. It scalped him. Then it started digging in, ripping off the bottom half of his jaw, the little bones in that tube in your neck, and then his ribs. I don't exactly remember what happened next, what combination of terror and instinct took over. But somehow, my dad's hunting knife ends up in the thing's shoulder, a final, desperate act of defiance. And my dad ends up on my back. I'm running, and by God, I'm running faster than I've ever run before or after. I know it's following me. I can feel its presence behind me, a heavy, suffocating darkness. I end up back in the woods, the ones opposite the ones we'd been in, heading toward my landlord's house, because it was only a half a mile away. I can hear this thing screeching and moaning. I hear the tree branches crack and get thrown around. It sounds like someone taking an axe to every single tree I pass. It's cracking so loud and often, but I'm not looking back. I can't. I finally trip, tumbling forward onto gravel. I look up, my head swimming with the shock and the terror, and there's my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire. It's a small slice of normal life, a scene I can't even process after what I've just been through. I scream and cry, and they come over, their faces shifting from confusion to concern. I'm telling them to call an ambulance, but my words are just a jumble of raw noise, and my landlord, his name was Bill, he looks at me, and I'll never forget what he said. "What's that on your back?" he asked me. And just as he said it, he saw one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere. It was what was left of my dad. Most of his head, his torso, but nothing after the waist. The flannel shirt was the only thing holding it together, a final, flimsy shroud. Suddenly, we hear it screeching. It's coming fast, an inhuman sound of rage and hunger. Bill grabs me, and my dad's remains are thrown to the ground. I'm fighting him, crying, because I still think we can save him somehow. I was just a kid, and I couldn't accept that he was gone, that what I was carrying was just a piece of him. But my dad had been gone before I even picked him up. Bill has to pick me up and throw me inside before I come with him, and he and his buddies were all inside, locking doors and getting guns ready. Bill looks at me, asking, "What happened? What happened out there?" But I just don't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it all together to understand that there was something dangerous out there, something more than a rabid dog or a bear's. All the lights in the house are on, and someone calls the cops. They'll be there in 15 minutes, a lifetime in that moment. We look outside and see it walk in front of the campfire they'd made. "I don't know what it is," one of them says. "It looks like an ape." But it wasn't. It was too pale, too gaunt, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. And then, without warning, something goes through the window. We shoot at it, but it ain't the thing. It's my landlord's dog, just the body, though, not his head or legs. It was a warning shot, a malicious taunt. We started pushing things in front of the doors and windows. A fridge, a table, anything we could find to barricade ourselves. Then we hear something in the garage. I remember one of his friends saying that the doors were open. A simple mistake that suddenly felt like a death sentence. We hear metal and glass just getting ripped apart, the sound of unimaginable force. We put a couch and a TV in front of the door to the garage. It banged around some more, and then it got quiet. Not silent like it was before. We could hear it move around some, its shallow weight shifting on the floorboards. The guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone hands me a pistol, a heavy, cold piece of metal in my shaking hands. No sooner did I cock the hammer back than we heard something shatter upstairs. The windows on the second floor. Then we heard it screech again, except now it was louder, and it didn't echo and fade out, because it was inside with us. We all rushed to the one door leading upstairs, and we got to it just as that thing did. It opened it just a bit, and 4 or 5 men just slammed into it. It got its hands through. Someone with a shotgun took care of that, put the barrel right up to its wrist and pulled the trigger. Cut its hand clean off. The force of the blast was deafening in the enclosed space, and the smell of ozone and burnt flesh filled the air. That only made it angry, though. It started pushing on the door, clawing at the wood. We were on one side pushing as best as we could, and it was on the other doing the same. That wood just wasn't going to hold, so someone tells us to keep our heads down. Suddenly, the top half of the door is just gone. My ears are ringing. and there are splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them just unloaded on the top of that door. A flurry of buckshot and pistol rounds. I don't really know where it went after that. The police showed up. I was still glued to that door. What was left of it? And the sun was up before they got me off it. They put me in a hospital for a while, and a lot of people talked to me, but I didn't talk back. Not for a long, long time. The memories were too vivid, too real. The smell, the sounds, the sight of that thing. It had become a part of me. When I got back home, I got a job from Bill, the landlord, working on the farm. We didn't talk much about that night, not directly. It was a silent, shared trauma that hung in the air between us. But I signed up for the Army when I was 19, and he sat me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I asked him right away what the police told him. The story they went with was a wild animal, probably a wolf or maybe a bear that had migrated north or something. I asked him about how they could say that when they had the hand. I knew they had it. It was proof. He looks at me, stunned. He tells me that hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it and his car wrecked and drove into a tree, died on impact. The hand was never found, probably taken away by an animal, the police said. And the cops, when they would acknowledge the hand even existed at all, said that it was simply the paw of a bear that looked like a human hand. I never ended up talking to that landlord again. I guess he went missing when I was in basic, and the cops never found him. They said he owed some people some money and just ran away. But I don't think it's that simple. He was a good man, a family man. He wouldn't have just run off, especially not after what he'd seen. It was too convenient, too neat. Just like the car crash. I never went back to those woods. I wouldn't. Not even if I had the whole goddamn U.S. Army at my back. And that was my father's story of the rake, or skinwalker. I'm still not sure what to think, but I have my theories. As I grew older, and when my mother died, I don't think my father felt that he had anything left. He had carried the weight of that night for his entire life. The guilt of not being able to protect his own father. The trauma of seeing him torn apart. I don't think he wanted to live with that anymore. It had become an obsession, a poison in his blood. He might as well settle old scores. He went back into those woods, I guess, and he never came back. The FBI was called, and they did a show and dance for everyone involved. But I knew that they weren't really looking. They never did find him. I was 23 years old, and a few years of working a soul-crushing job had made me a staunch believer in one simple, unyielding truth. Adult life is about the little victories. For me, that meant finally affording a full set of a new tactical gear. I'd been saving for months, meticulously budgeting every paycheck to buy a pair of good boots, a tactical vest, and even a mil-spec gas mask. To some, it might sound like I was just playing Army, but for me, it was like Christmas morning. Getting to put it all on and walk out into the Ozark woods of Arkansas, specifically, was like opening a new world. This wasn't just about playing, this was a field test. I had my own personal prototypes I wanted to try out, starting with my bolt-action rifle, a little nugget I'd nicknamed. It wasn't built for a bear. No, but against a snake, a stray dog, or a cougar, it would absolutely ruin their day. I was having a great time, too, romping around the woods, getting a feel for the weight of my gear, and playing with the field of view in the mask. I'd built a couple of custom stripper clips for the nugget and loaded up my pouches with a bunch of rolled-up targets and a light complement of survival gear. I had a compass, a topographical map, a thermal blanket, some extra underwear, MREs, a canteen, and a camelback, the works. I was basically prepared for any disaster, no matter how unlikely, my own little invasion of one. The sun was high and the heat was doing its job, but I was in my element. I wandered down to a creek bed, dry as a bone this time of year, and decided it was a perfect place to practice some guerrilla tactics. No danger of getting my gear wet, just the risk of my own sweat. I checked my safety, then proceeded to do a series of screen slides and uphill hustles in full gear. Needless to say, I got winded fast. I stood panting in that dry stream bed, a little lightheaded, and decided it was time to check my position and set a course for home. I was in the middle of reorienting myself, my eyes scanning the map and my hand steadying the compass, when I caught a breeze that carried with it a smell. At first, I thought it was just my own funk, the sour stink of sweat and exertion. But the odor quickly evolved into something far worse. A dark, visceral undercurrent of rot and decay, deep notes of animal musk mixed with the nauseating stench of raw garbage. It was a bassy, thick, black score, punctuated by a garlicky, metallic tang and a faint, skunky, onion-like sludge. It wasn't just a bad smell. It was a smell with texture, with layers. A smell that felt like it was filling up my lungs and coating the back of my throat. I immediately went into straight operating mode. My hand went to my pouch, and I popped an Adderall for some extra focus, then pulled the clipazine from my nugget. It seemed to be working fine, but if I was going to have to shoot something, I preferred no risk of jamming. The smell was so strong it made me gag, and I nearly puked up that Adderall tablet. At this point, I knew whatever the source was. It was mobile, and it was getting closer. I pulled my mask up from around my neck and over my face. It helped, but the mask wasn't 100% airtight, and some of that soul-crushing smell still managed to seep in. I walked cautiously and slowly along the creek bed, listening for any sign of what was up there. Twig snapping, a grunt, a rustle. I heard something shuffling around, a near-constant snuffling grunt, and the sloppy, uncoordinated crunching of bark and leaves. It sounded big, bigger than anything my nugget was made for. My mind immediately jumped to the one thing that could smell this bad and make these kinds of sounds. A big bear. A truly massive, maybe even rabid one. And if you're from the Ozarks, you know that's more than just a passing thought. Let me tell you something about Ozark big bears, straight from my dad's mouth. My dad's lived in the Ozarks for 58 years, and in all that time, only two things have managed to genuinely shake him to his core: the challenge of fatherhood and the big bears. According to him, the native black bear population was hunted to near extinction back in the 40s and 50s. To correct this, the Arkansas Fish and Game Commission, along with the ANRC and NRCs, released 250 bears into the Ozarks and Ouachita Mountains. The official story, plastered all over their websites, insists that they were all black bears. My dad, however, insists that's a pile of bullcrap. According to him, a good number of those bears were not black bears, but brown bears. And they didn't just stay in their designated spots. They inbred with the few remaining local bears and the newly reintroduced blacks. What happened next was a genetic nightmare. Thanks to a little phenomenon known as hybrid vigor, the resulting offspring were bigger, meaner, and more volatile than their parents. And, to top it all off, they were unbelievably fertile. They weren't just bigger, they were a new, monstrous breed, a perversion of nature born from bureaucratic arrogance. I remember asking him to prove it. He didn't say a word. He just left the summer porch, went upstairs, and came back with a manila folder labeled BB. Inside were a few grainy Polaroids, the kind of pictures that make you lean in closer, squinting to make out details that are just slightly too blurry. He handed one to me. I saw a massive, shaggy, black and brown creature rooting around a clothesline. It was impossible to get a sense of scale until he pointed out the clothesline in our own yard, about 50 feet away, strung between two poles, about 5 to 6 feet off the ground. It was the same clothesline from the picture. He directed my attention to the creature in the photo, and I saw it. The thing's shoulder was about a foot below the line, even though it was further back in the shot. It was a beast. I looked through the other photos. One was barely concealed by trees. Another was tearing into a trash can. All of them slightly shaky, the details hard to make out, but the scale was undeniable. I was convinced. My dad told me two things about how to avoid getting attacked by the big bears. First, he said, big bears are dumb as crap. He claimed it was something to do with the hybrid genetics, a sort of mental handicap that made them more dangerous because they lack the natural fear of humans that most wild animals possess. This is also what made them smell like pure garbage. You could smell one coming from a mile off. His rule was simple. If you smell a big bear, get inside, get upstairs, and take the 12 gauge with some deer slugs. Second, he said, if you do see a big bear and you ain't home, or you ain't got a shotgun loaded with slugs, hide up a tree if you can. He said running was useless. They're faster than you, son. There ain't any point in running. I tell you all of this because after 23 years, I'd finally managed to prove my dad wrong about something. Well, half wrong. There was something in the Ozarks that matched his pictures of big bears. Something that smelled like a garbage dump and sounded like a locomotive. But whatever they were, they sure as heck weren't bears. I would have stayed in that creek bed and waited for whatever was up there to screw off on its own. But the light was already slanting through the trees, turning the woods into a long, dark shadow. As bad as my dad made big bears sound, I sure as heck wasn't wanting to be stuck with a goddamn rabid one after dark. The primal fear of what lurks in the deep woods after sunset took over, and I decided to climb up the opposite side of the creek bed. I had to scramble over some big rock outcroppings, half standing and half leaning against the steep slope of the hill. But I figured, if anything, it would be an extra layer of protection. I had gotten a few glimpses of it over my shoulder as I climbed, but this was my first good look at it, and I just couldn't stop staring. Like I said in my previous post, this was not a bear. It was bear-like, but not a bear. I've been a sci-fi nerd my entire life, and I even have a copy of Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials from my awesome late stepmom. So when I saw this thing for the first time, my freaking nerd brain immediately went, oh, a solidor. Except it wasn't. It looked like a solidor, a grizzly bear, and a sloth had a three-way on top of a garage heap to make it. It had a long prognathouse snout, like a stubby trunk, with big, angular shoulders. Its feet looked like manhole covers, covered in dirty, matted fur, and its body was like a furry blimp. Its fur was the same charcoal black and dark brown I saw in the pictures, full of mats and clumps of dirt. I mean, I stared at it for so long, drinking in those horrific details, trying to make sense of something that defied all logic. For 2.5 minutes, I just stood there, mesmerized, and it somehow didn't notice me. Jesus, these things were truly dumb. I felt a twinge of relief. If it hadn't noticed me scrambling out of a rocky gully, it probably wouldn't notice me sneaking away from it. And that's when it happened. It's going to sound ridiculous, but I farted. Then the something stopped, My breath stopped. My heart stopped. The only sound in those woods at that moment was my freaking fart echoing off the rocks and the sound of my nose blistering under the something's truly odoriferous assault as it was like slow motion. The thing turned its head, looked back at me, sniffed the air, and slowly stood up. It had been shuffling around, crouched low to the ground the entire time. What I thought were its shoulder blades were its freaking elbows. It could have tied its shoes without bending over, but its paws probably would have crushed its Air Jordans to bits. They were like trash can lids. The thing sniffed the air again, then coughed or barked, like it was asking me a question. It sounded like gorp. I swear on my mom, that's what it sounded like. Gorp. So there I was. The idiot who didn't listen to his dad. The awkward cringelord who freaking farts when he's trying to sneak away from a freaking gorp. I aimed at it, centered on its mass. And I fired. The shot didn't thock into the gorp like a bullet hitting flesh and bone. Instead, it sort of thudded, if that makes any sense. There was a puff of dirt and hair where it hit, and bless my luck, the gorp actually flinched from the impact. I waited for the red, for the spurt of blood I expected to see. I guess their poor hygiene and nasty, flea-ridden hair mats had over time given them a kind of natural body armor because I didn't see any red at all. Not even a speck. All it did was rear up and gorp at me again, a low, guttural growl that had my colon producing enough bricks to build a barricade. It was a sound that seemed to shake the very air around me, a sound filled with rage and something far more ancient and terrible. I worked the bolt and fired another shot, this time at its ugly, sloth bear, elephant-looking face. And this time, it did thock, and so did the dirt a few feet to the thing's left, because the bullet ricocheted clean off its skull. The thing stood there, staring at me like it was too dumb to realize it could have just stood in the stream bed and grabbed me by my face while I pelted it with useless bullet after useless bullet. I yelled at it and fired a third shot in any direction at all, trying to scare it off. It didn't work. The gorp, or gore, or big bear, or whatever it was, dropped to all fours and lurched forward toward me. That's when I did a 180 and shuffled away. It worked. I stood there, watching the sky turn from blue to orange as the sun set, before I snapped out of it and began my tactical retreat back home. The adrenaline of the chase and the shock of what I had seen had left me in a daze, and I moved like an automaton, my legs just carrying me forward. When I finally got back, I told my dad the story. I probably should have mentioned that I was visiting him for a few days, but I was so shaken, the words just tumbled out. He could probably smell the big bear on me, so there was no use lying. When I got to the part about what the big bears really were, he refused to believe me. Then he got pissed at me, locked the doors, and camped out upstairs for the rest of my visit. I had to freaking bring him beer from downstairs. The weirdest thing is, as scared as he was, and as weirded out as I was seeing him that scared, I wasn't scared myself. I remember that very clearly, not being scared at all. I guess you could say I was just too interested or curious to be scared, because if I was scared, I would have just bolted away. And I'd probably be typing this from inside of a year-old gorp turd if I had to guess. Maybe that Adderall I popped kept me from switching into run home scared to mama mode. Well, that's how I met a gorp and lived. I'm 21 and a college senior from Connecticut, but I'm no stranger to the grittier side of life. See, I go to school in Washington, D.C., and not the nice part was either. I'm talking about the part where the sirens are a constant soundtrack, where you see people slumped over on corners, and where the presence of a cop is more of a relief than a cause for concern. You learn to read people, to spot the signs of a substance user or a person who's just one bad day away from a full-blown crisis. You learn to keep your head on a swivel. And I've definitely seen some things in my day. It's a survival instinct I've honed. It would be good to mention here that I'm not some little guy, either. I'm 6'1", 240 pounds. A good portion of it muscle. Though Lord knows, I could stand to drop about 15 pounds. I love to smoke, drink, and eat sushi. And despite all that, I'm a good student who picked a real major, accounting. It's a dry subject, I know, but it's a living. I interned for a mid-sized PR firm, doing accounting work and getting paid $20 an hour. College is expensive, and that alone wasn't cutting it. So I deliver pizzas at night after the office closes. The place I work is a cheap sort of pizza joint with an absurdly large delivery radius. It's about 20 minutes from my house and 5 minutes from the beach, but our range extends another 50 minutes past my place. The further north you go from the shop, the more rural it gets. The neighborhoods fall away, the street lights become sparse, and the woods creep right up to the edge of the asphalt. I was in the back, folding pizza boxes like a good little boy, when the counter girl came back with a delivery slip. She was about 16, kind of shy, and always a little spacey. She told me the customer sounded weird on the phone. Kind of like he was talking through a fan or his hands, and that he was kind of gurgling. My experience instantly made my mind jump to some kind of drug user. A benzo freak perhaps, or maybe something even worse. I was already picturing a strange interaction before I even looked at the address. And when I did, my heart sank. It was basically in the middle of nowhere. I was a little mad, because I didn't want to drive that far. But what can you do? It's part of the job. But it wasn't just the address that was weird. It was the weirdest ticket I've ever seen. The guy had ordered a large pizza with anchovies, ground beef, ham, sausage, pepperoni. Literally, $15 worth of extras piled on top. It was less of a pizza and more of a meat and fish casserole on a crust. I went to ask the counter girl if she was sure this was right, and she just shrugged and said she thought so. She couldn't really make out what he was saying, so she just did her best. I cut her some slack. She was just a kid, probably daydreaming while taking the call. To be sure, I'd just give them a call back. I dialed the phone and it rang 5 times. 10, 20, 30. No one answered. I hung up and called again. This time, the phone went right to a message. The number you have dialed does not have a voicemail box that has been set up yet. Goodbye. Just like that. No ring, no static. Just a cold, robotic voice. The kind of message that makes the hairs on your arm stand up for a second. It was unnerving. Still, my manager decided to just make the pizza as ordered. We'd proceed from there. I figured I'd deliver a quick, separate order and maybe, just maybe, when I got back, someone else would have taken the strange one. I went out and delivered a separate pizza to a hilariously big guy and a couple who invited me in for a drink. I was polite, but I never drink or smoke when I'm working. It's just a personal rule. The whole time, my mind was on that other order. The weird one. I was hoping against hope that by the time I got back to the shop, someone else would have taken it. I'd seen a new guy come in while I was leaving, and I figured maybe he'd be dumb enough to take the long-haul ticket. But of course, that wasn't the case. I walked back in, and there it was, sitting on the counter, still in its box, looking just as unappealing and suspicious as it did 10 minutes ago. My manager gave me the look, a mix of expectation and pity, and with a begrudging sigh, I took the pizza and got back into my car. The night was getting on, and I just wanted to get this over with. I entered the address into my phone. It was on a side street adjacent to a park that locals call open space. Despite the peaceful-sounding name, this place was anything but. It was about 500 acres of straight-up, untamed woods. The address was about 25 minutes away, basically at the very edge of our delivery range. And then some. I put on some dubstep and cranked my turbo Subaru, trying to drown out the growing feeling of unease as I headed out. Now, if you're not from a rural area, this can be hard to explain. Winter in the woods is a different kind of scary. It's not the spooky kind you see in movies, with rustling leaves and creaking branches. It's the profound, bone-deep silence. There's never a single sound. The air is too cold for insects, and most of the animals are either hibernating or too quiet to hear. It's just you and the overwhelming, suffocating silence. Unless, of course, there's something larger than a cat walking around. The road became darker and narrower. The tall pines crowded in on either side, their skeletal branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Finally, I made it to the address. The street had a few houses, but they were spaced out on 5-acre plots, so they were a fair distance apart. I was looking for number 134. I passed 1130, then a long stretch of black road with nothing. And then the numbers picked up again at 11 from 44. What the heck? I just wanted to get this over with and get back to the shop without getting attacked by some pillhead over something as small as a pizza. I figured maybe the numbers were out of order, or perhaps the house was just set back from the road. I tried calling their number again. It rang, and then it just stopped ringing. I waited. Nothing. Then, a faint sound. Wait a minute. Someone had picked up, but there was no voice. Instead, I heard a low, throbbing buzz, a humming sound. And then it started coming through my car stereo. It was getting louder and louder. A deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards and up my spine. It was a sickening, electric buzz that sounded more like a machine than anything a phone should produce. I panicked and hung up, not wanting to ruin my speakers or my sanity. The windows were starting to fog up, and the air in the car felt thick and heavy. I was pulled over between two of these houses, trapped by the dark woods and the terrifying silence. The buzzing sound had rattled me to my core. I rolled the windows down to clear the fog, and in doing so, I was hit by the most overpowering stench I have ever smelled. It wasn't just bad, it was the foul, cloying odor of decaying trash, rotting meat, and something else. Something chemical and sharp, like 100 cleaning products mixed with raw sewage. It reminded me of driving through Newark, New Jersey, but 100 times worse. More potent and vile. The smell was so gross it made my eyes water and my stomach clench. I put the car in first and started pulling towards the next house, trying to escape the smell and find a way out of this impossible situation. At the end of the long driveway, I saw it, a stone post with a light on top, illuminating a patch of gravel. My plan was to pull in, knock, and ask if maybe they'd given me the wrong number. It was a long shot, but what else could I do? It would make some sort of twisted sense for these kinds of people, the kind who live out in the middle of nowhere and order $15 worth of toppings on a pizza. I was probably 100 feet away when I saw someone step out of the darkness and into the circle of light at the bottom of the driveway. I sighed in relief. Thank goodness. It was the guy that ordered. My mind still running on my D.C. playbook was expecting him to be all over the place, leaning, acting completely out of his mind from whatever drugs he was on. But he was actually pretty calm. He just stood there. I stopped the car about 10 feet away from him. He was a giant, probably a good 5 inches taller than my 6'1", and he was wearing a big black coat that looked 3 sizes too big for him. It was almost like a child wearing their parents' coat. I didn't look right at him at first. I was just focused on the job. I grabbed the pizza from the passenger seat, stepped out of the car, and then grabbed the ticket and prepared to make change in case he was paying cash. "Hey, sir, sorry about the wait," I said, my voice a little too high and nervous. I made a bunch of calls, but the line was weird. Delivery's pretty far out here." There was no response. The silence was thick, and the smell was still there. Extremely pungent. I knew for a fact it wasn't trash day in this area. It couldn't be. The smell was coming from him, from that spot. I placed the pizza on the roof of my car, a nervous habit, and he was still standing there, unmoving, under the light on the opposite side. I finally forced myself to pay enough attention to get a good look at him. He was a giant, even bigger than I'd initially thought. He was wearing no shoes, just standing on the cold, hard ground. His jeans were ripped up and had stains all over them. And his face. I tried to get a good look at his face. His eyes seemed sunken in, the light from the post not reflecting off them at all. I couldn't even see the actual pupils. It was like they were just black craters, holes that swallowed the light. At this point, I was really sketched out. The guy hadn't moved or said a word. The silence was becoming unbearable. I stopped my routine and just stared at him. And he stared right back at me with those freaky, bottomless eyes. His head was sort of bobbing side to side, but not in any sort of fluid sense. It was more like a car door, the way it stops halfway open. Then you give it another shove and it stops at the all-the-way point. His head did this with no real pattern for about 10 seconds. Just a series of jerky, robotic movements. Between the stench, the head movements, the eyes, and his total lack of a response, I felt a deep, primal fear setting in. I stood frozen. I was completely locked in place, unable to move, unable to look away from his terrifying, empty stare. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation for what I was seeing. A drug trip? A mental breakdown? But none of it fit. The silence, the smell, the jerky movements, it was all wrong. Without breaking eye contact, I slowly, deliberately, took my phone out of my pocket. I held it low, angled so I could look at the guy and my screen at the same time. My curiosity, my need to understand, was overwhelming my fear. I went to my recent calls and redialed his number. The phone started ringing, but I couldn't hear it anywhere. My heart hammered in my chest. Did the guy have it on silent? Was it a trick? Wait, I did hear it. It was faint, but I could hear a cell phone ringing. It wasn't coming from the man in front of me. It was coming from the quiet of the woods, about 50 yards away. A faint, distant, tinny ringtone. And in that moment, the cold, horrifying realization hit me. I was kicking myself for being so naive, for ignoring all the red flags. The person who had called, who had placed the order, was not the person standing here. This thing was just waiting. The guy was still doing the head thing, That bizarre, jerky bobbing. But as I processed the truth, I swear to God, I saw him smile. It wasn't a normal smile. It was a widening of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes, a grim, inhuman rictus that was all teeth and empty blackness. Finally, I mustered up the courage to speak, my voice shaky and thin. Can you please come get this?" I stammered, my words jumbling together. "Also, I think you might have dropped your phone or something when you were, hiding a body or whatever. In the woods." I laughed nervously, a desperate, hollow sound in the dead silence. I was still trying to rationalize it, still clinging to the idea that this was just a crazed drug addict. I watched as his mouth opened, head still bobbing, feet planted firmly on the ground. He made a low, guttural grunt, quick and rough, followed by a high grunt, and then another low one. They were soft, almost like someone clearing their throat, a kind of wet, rasping sound. At this point, I was ready to book it back to the driver's seat. Just as I went to redial that phone, my finger hovering over the screen, I heard him talk. The voice was not this one I had heard on the phone. It wasn't a human voice. It was a distorted, halting sound that was both soft and razor sharp. A voice that was too high and too low all at once. "That phone's not mine." The pause between "not" and "mine" was way too long. The first part sounded like a single, monstrous word. "Phone's not." The second part, "mine," came out an octave higher, a squeak of unnatural clarity. My mind went into DEFCON 5, full-on panic mode. My knees were weak, and I was about to pass out. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the person who made the order was no longer alive. This thing had taken the call, and it was waiting for me. I pushed the pizza to the far side of the car roof, away from me. I was shaking so badly, I thought I might drop it. But my hands were locked in place. I finally mustered up the strength to speak, my voice a pathetic whisper. "Sir, you're freaking me out. I got a 45 and less than $20 on me. Just take this so I can leave." It was a complete lie, of course. I had no gun, but I was desperate. The words were a last-ditch attempt to show strength, to make this thing understand that I was not a victim, even though I was absolutely terrified. When I said this, the bobbing of his head stopped. His eyes, those dark, burning holes, seemed to bore a hole right through me. The smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed emptiness that was even more unnerving. He opened his mouth again. A single, wet grunt came out, and then a series of words, strung together like a child learning to talk. What? My mind went blank. I couldn't understand. Was he asking me what I meant? Was he confused? I just stared, completely stunned. The creature's face was still, its eyes fixed on mine. And then, as if an invisible switch was flipped, it began to move. It wasn't a walk. It wasn't a run. It was a single, huge muscle spasm that propelled it forward, a sort of jerky, inhuman jump that covered the distance between us in a second. It was right in front of me now, and it spoke again. The phone was his. The voice was the same as before, halting and unnatural, but now it was filled with a strange, possessive anger. It was as if it was correcting an unseen mistake. "The phone was his," it repeated. I was on the verge of tears. My entire body felt like it was shutting down. The creature's movements were so wrong, so violent and jerky. It jumped again, now closer to the car. I could feel the heat radiating off it, and the smell was now so overpowering it was almost visible, a thick, coppery fog. "Phone's not his anymore," I blubbered, the words spilling out of me in a desperate, meaningless jumble. I gathered myself, forcing air into my lungs, and then I screamed, "I'm going to call the cops. Man, if you don't just get out of here." The thing's mouth split into that creepy, black smile again, and without moving its lips, I heard it speak in a completely different voice. A voice I had never heard before. A voice that was clear and melodic and completely out of place. It was a woman's voice, cold and authoritative. "Go away. Stop following me. I will call the police." It was a voice of a victim, a haunting echo of a real person. And it was coming from the thing in front of me. I watched, horrified, as it reached forward in another big, jerky motion, grabbed the pizza off the roof, and placed two round things on the car. They were quarters, surrounded by a dark, viscous liquid that spread over the roof. I didn't even think. I just jumped into the car and peeled out. I left the pizza sleeve, the ticket, everything. I didn't even close the door all the way. I just hit the gas, my tires squealing, and sped down the road, going about 80 miles an hour. Here is the conclusion of your story, with added punctuation and formatting to maximize the final moments of fear and the sense of a lingering threat. I drove for about a quarter of a mile, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and then I slammed on the brakes. A U-turn. I had to turn back. I couldn't risk getting lost even more with that psycho out there. My car spun around on the gravel, and I whipped down the road, back toward the place where I had just been. As I flew past the driveway, I slammed on the brakes and looked. He was gone. The light was still on, but there was nothing there. Just an empty, silent driveway. I finally reached the end of the road, where there was a stop sign to merge with the main road. I was trembling so hard I could barely hold the wheel. I looked to my right, the direction I was turning, to make sure it was clear, and then I looked to my left. That thing's face was 12 inches from my own, pressed against the driver's side window. Its black, sunken eyes were burning into mine, and that awful, soulless smile was back. I had a tactical heart attack, a pure, animalistic terror that seized my body and mind. I didn't think. I just mashed the gas pedal to the floor. The car lurched forward, tires screaming, and I peeled off down the road, away from the stop sign and the thing that had been waiting for me. I didn't look back. I just drove. Somehow, I made it back to the pizza place. My body was shaking uncontrollably, and my teeth were chattering so hard I thought they might break. I was in such a state of shock that I walked into the front door of the pizza place and reached for a cigarette, a habit I never, ever indulge in when I'm working. The counter girl, the one who took the order, looked up at me with wide, concerned eyes. "Hey," she said, her voice a nervous whisper. "That guy at the open space house just called back. He said you forgot some food, but he only ordered the pizza, right?" She waited a beat for me to answer. "He wants you to come back." That's when I broke down. I started crying. Huge, heaving sobs that came from a place of pure terror. I was bawling my eyes out in front of this teenage girl, but I didn't even care. The phone. I had to check my phone. It had been thrown to the floor of the car when I had swerved, and when I looked, there were 14 missed calls, all from his number. All the voicemails were empty, except for the last one. I hit play. All I could hear was ragged breathing and those low, guttural grunting sounds I had heard from the creature at the end of the driveway. The message was long, about a minute of nothing but wet, labored breathing and a series of soft, horrible grunts. It was a message of possession, of triumph. It was telling me, that it had my number, and that it would find me again. I sat there for 10 minutes, just trying to calm down, when I remembered the change he had left on the roof. I steadily went back out to my car and turned on a flashlight. The roof was covered in a viscous, dark fluid. It smelled like copper and something sweet and sickly, like maple syrup mixed with blood. I threw up, the contents of my stomach burning my throat. I found the quarters in the panel gap between the trunk and the rear window. They were covered in that same gross goop, stuck fast, and wedged next to them. I could now see what appeared to be a soft, little chunk of tissue. My veins turned to ice. I went to open my car door, and there it was. A single line of the fluid, a trail of that foul liquid, going from the front quarter panel all the way to the driver's side door. That thing had tried to open my door when it was next to me at the stop sign. It wanted in. It wanted more than just a pizza. I went back inside, crying even harder now, and told the counter girl to try and call the number again for me. She tried over and over, but the phone went right to voicemail. The next morning, I gave the number to my uncle, who was a police captain a few towns over. He told me the number was a burner phone, paid in cash, and completely untraceable. It appeared to have been turned off now. He told me to forget about it, that it was probably just a twisted prank from some local kids. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, and I knew what I had heard. I sleep with the lights on these days. It was the summer of 2013, and I was feeling that itch. The one you get when the days are long and the air is thick with heat and possibility. I decided it was time to kill coyotes, not just for the thrill of the hunt, but for that sweet, sweet fur. I wasn't a professional hunter or anything. I had a bare bones, basic AR-15 I'd gotten for cheap, a kind of starter kit for the woods. I've always liked the way an AK slings a rifle, so I got a sling point to put on the barrel and slung it on my right side, around my neck, in a messenger bag style. It felt right, comfortable, and ready. I packed my ATV and took off, a couple of hours' drive up into the mountains to an old cabin I used for this very purpose. Upon arriving, I took the key from the ignition and looked around. The air was different up here, thin and clean, with the scent of pine and damp earth. For the past few weeks, I'd been throwing squirrel and rabbit guts into the woods nearby to attract predators. A classic, simple bait pile. I'd been planning this for a while. As I checked my bait, I found it all gone. Every last scrap. This wasn't strange in itself. Coyotes, bears, and other scavengers are common, but something about it felt off. A strange, heavy feeling persisted, like the forest was holding its breath. Just then, I saw the guy who lived on the mountain, just down the road, leave in his car. I decided I should look around in the woods, just a little, to see if I could spot any fresh tracks or signs of what had been by. Every time I stepped, I kept thinking that I heard another footstep, a soft shuffling through the grass and brush that didn't match my own rhythm. I would stop, and the sound would stop. I would move, and it would move with me. It felt like walking with an echo. Then, in the distance, a little bit down the hill from me, I saw it. A stick figure-shaped thing. It was unnaturally thin and tall, its limbs looking more like snapped branches than flesh. I wasn't quite sure what I was seeing, so I just sorta waved at it. like you do when you see a stranger in the woods and you're not sure if you should be friendly or scared. It didn't wave back. It just slipped silently behind a tree, as if it had never been there at all. I shook my head, thinking maybe the heat was getting to me. "Okay, goodbye," I muttered to myself, deciding it was time to call it a day and walk back to the cabin. My plan was to just sit around and drink for a while, to forget the weirdness of the afternoon and get ready for a night of hunting. I settled in on the porch, cracking open a beer and listening to the hum of the forest as dusk fell. The sun was a smear of orange and purple on the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I started hearing coyote yelps in the distance, a familiar sound that was usually the soundtrack to a night like this. I got my rifle ready, thinking I might be able to blast a couple of fools if they got close enough. I sat there with the lights off, a silhouette on my own porch, waiting, but nothing came by. The sounds of the woods just seemed to fade in and out, the coyotes' howls growing more and more distant until they were just a whisper on the wind. And then the whispering turned into something else. It was a distant, "Help me." My stomach did a slow flip. It was faint, but unmistakable. It sounded human. I've heard of animals, especially coyotes and even birds, mimicking human voices. It's a survival tactic, a way to lure in prey or scare off competitors. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a strange quirk of nature, an echo of a previous camper or something. But the sound was too clear, too raw. I looked over to the neighbor's house, and the lights were off, which was odd. It didn't click that he had left earlier. I just thought maybe he was out, or asleep. The cry came again, a little closer this time. "Help me. Help me." It was laced with a chilling desperation. I got up from my chair and listened, straining my ears. The logical part of my brain, the part that wanted a simple, mundane explanation, took over. He must have broken his leg, I thought. Stuck in the woods with coyotes, or something worse. The thought of a fellow human in danger, especially one I knew, was enough to override the strange dread that had been building inside me all day. I convinced myself that this was a normal situation, a simple search and rescue. I had a rifle, an ATV, and a flashlight. I was equipped for this. I got close enough to the edge of the woods to tell that the cries were coming from an ATV trail that snaked deeper into the forest. So I decided to take my own ATV and my AR, driving towards the person saying, "Help me." The thought that the voice could be a lure, a trap, never once crossed my mind. All I could think about was helping someone in need. The ride was rough, the ATV bouncing over roots and rocks as I followed the winding trail. The cries of "help me" seemed to get closer, more urgent, with every twist and turn. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a mix of adrenaline and a desire to get to the person as fast as possible. The trail eventually led to a U-shaped dip in the path, a common feature in the rough terrain. Without hitting my brakes, I just coasted down it, confident in the ATV's ability to handle the descent. It was a mistake I would regret for the rest of my life. As I reached the bottom, a voice screamed, "Helped me," right in front of me on the trail. It was no longer distant or faint. It was a gut-wrenching, ear-splitting shriek that seemed to come from just a few feet away. So close, it felt like a physical blow. The suddenness of it, the horrifying proximity, completely unnerved me. It was like someone had been waiting in the dark for me. I freaked out, trying to swerve the ATV to avoid whatever was in front of me. But in my panic, I ended up overcorrecting. The wheels caught, and the whole machine flipped, throwing me forward and then pinning me underneath. The world went black for a minute. I can't really remember the impact, just the sudden, jarring motion and the feeling of the heavy machine coming down on me. I woke up under the ATV, the crushing weight of it on top of me. The air was knocked out of me, and I lay there, stunned, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the inky blackness. The sound of the engine was gone, replaced by a terrifying silence. I felt around, trying to figure out what was happening. My left leg was pinned under the ATV, and the pain was a dull, persistent throb. I tried pushing the machine off, straining every muscle in my body, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like the weight of it had gotten 100 pounds heavier in a couple of seconds. An invisible force, like a hand holding it down, seemed to be at play. The sling around my neck told me that I still had my rifle, and that brought a small sense of relief. With my good arm, I dragged it to me, my hand finding the familiar cold metal. As I did, I realized my arm was bleeding, a deep gash from the fall. I checked over the gun as best I could in the dark. The handguard was messed up and the stock was cracked, but it appeared to still be functional. I had 30 rounds in the magazine, 30 rounds to keep me safe until the night was over or anyone, found me. I sat still, trying to slow my breathing, and listened closely to the sounds of the forest. The silence was everything. It was a dead quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. And I don't think I've ever felt more fear than I have in this moment. The dead quiet was broken by a new sound, a soft shuffling in the grass. It was slow and deliberate, not the skittering of a coyote or the heavy tread of a bear. It was a footstep, then another, dragging through the brush. The cries of "help me" started again, a whisper this time, but they were no longer a desperate plea. They were a taunt, an imitation, and they were getting closer. I didn't know if I should respond or just sit in silence. I didn't want to alert whatever it was to my position, but my mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, to break the awful stillness. The shuffling got closer and closer, and then something appeared over the ATV. It was like if you had fallen at a bar and the bartender sort of looked at you funny, a silent judgment from a place of unassailable height. This thing looked like it was 9 feet tall, its body a gaunt, frozen solid silhouette against the faint moonlight. Its head tilted, a black void where a face should have been. It just stood there, staring down at me. And I twiddled my fingers, a nervous tic I'd had since I was a kid, reaching for my gun. I brought it to my shoulder, the cold metal a small comfort against my shaking body, and sat there, pointed at whatever this thing was. I didn't want to look at it. The primal fear that gripped me was so overwhelming that I felt if I truly met its gaze, I would lose my mind. It was a kind of fear that transcended logic, a complete and utter terror that told me I was in the presence of something ancient and malevolent, something that had no business existing in our world. I heard it again, a whisper of "help me." The sound was right there, just above me, echoing the exact phrase that had lured me into this trap. And then I heard it climbing over the ATV. It moved with a sickening, disjointed grace, the sounds of its brittle limbs scraping against the metal of the four-wheeler. I looked away, my gaze fixed on a patch of forest floor, but it was too late. I felt a cold, dry hand grip my face. My mind went completely blank, the terror so profound that it became a white noise, and I was looking for the trigger on my rifle but couldn't find it. I was just a passenger in my own body, an observer to my own impending doom. Slowly, the thing moved my head over, turning my face to meet its own. I was face to face with this creature, and the image of it has been burned into my mind ever since. It looked like how almost everyone describes them, a golem that had done crack. Its face was carved up, with sunken cheeks and deep-set eyes that were just black pits of nothing. Its mouth was a gaping maw, full of small, sharp teeth, and its skin was a sickly, pale gray, stretched taut over a frame of bone. To this day, I've never smelled anything quite as bad as the breath from that thing, a stench of decay and something ancient, like the inside of a tomb. It wasn't the smell of a wild animal, it was the smell of wrongness itself. My mind went blank with terror, but a single, lucid thought cut through the fear. I felt the flash hider on my AR bump into something, the cold metal against its bony shoulder, and I remembered that I had it aimed at the thing. My brain rebooted. It was the only chance I had. I screamed as loud as I could, a guttural, primal sound ripped from my throat. It screamed back, a high-pitched, inhuman shriek that tore at my eardrums. I started yanking, not pulling or squeezing the trigger as fast as I could. The gun was going off, a series of deafening explosions in the dead of the forest, and my ears started to ring. The creature didn't recoil. Instead, it moved with a terrifying speed, grabbing my hair with its other hand and starting to slam my head into the ground as fast as it could. I was still pulling the trigger, the rifle bucking in my hand, but it was useless. It ripped the gun from my hand with a sickening crunch of bone and began to beat me with it. The screams were still coming, both mine and the creature's, a cacophony of sheer, unadulterated madness. It was still screaming as loud as it could, a sound of pure rage and malice, while beating me over the head with my own gun, the stock splintering against my skull. I could feel the blood running into my eyes and my vision started to blur. Lights started flickering through the woods, strange beams of light cutting through the trees, a surreal spectacle that felt like the final moments before death. I was about to black out when I heard something louder than the screaming, a gunshot, so powerful it vibrated through the ground. I swear I saw the thing's head fly open, a dark mist of something not quite blood exploding into the air. I dropped my gun, the weight of it, the cold steel that had been my only comfort, was nothing compared to the terror that seized me in that moment. I screamed like a child who had just been shoved into an oven, a sound I didn't know I was capable of making, and I ran for it. My gun was dropped about 10 feet from my head, a dark shape in the grass. The light that had flickered through the woods was getting closer now, and I didn't know if I was dying or being saved. All I knew was that I had to get away from whatever that thing was, whatever had just been standing over me. Suddenly, I heard a new sound, a human voice screaming my name, telling me to hold on. A hand tugged on my arm, pulling me with a strength I didn't think was possible. I looked over, and it was the guy who lived down the road, the same man I had seen leaving earlier. He had a huge revolver in his hand, a Magnum Research BFR, a massive hand cannon that looked like it belonged in a movie. The barrel was smoking slightly in the cool night air. The look on his face was one of pure shock and terror, his eyes wide and wild. He didn't look at me. He was looking past me, at something I couldn't see. At that moment, the world just went black. I passed out from the pain, the shock, and the pure, unadulterated fear. I woke up much later in a hospital, a ton of stitches in my head, and a splitting headache that made me regret every single moment of consciousness. When I eventually got out, a few days later, I went to see my neighbor. I had to know. I had to know what he saw. He was sitting on his porch, a shotgun across his lap, and the look in his eyes was still distant and haunted. I asked him, "What did you see that night? What was that thing?" He just replied, "A bear. We get them often up here." He said it with a finality that made it clear the conversation was over. But I'm not entirely convinced. I know what a bear looks like. I know what a bear does when it's angry. A bear doesn't mimic a human voice to lure you into a trap. A bear doesn't grab a rifle and use it like a club. I was nearly beaten to death with my own gun. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever attacked me wasn't from the animal kingdom at all. And I know, deep down in my gut, that a bear wouldn't make his head fly open with a single shot from a .45-70. It was around November of last year, and I had just moved to Washington State. As a guy who loves the outdoors, I was in my element. My new home state was an adventurer's paradise, a stark contrast to where I grew up. Being new to the area, I told a few friends of mine who were huge woods fiends about my fascination with the wilderness. They decided to take me out to a spot they knew, somewhere deep and secluded. What the hell, Sal? I thought. I'll do it. I need some time away from work anyway. I had the weekend off, so I packed my bag, cleaned my hunting rifle, and headed over to my friend Greg's house. We were a group of 6, plus 2 dogs, a big happy Labrador named Gus, and a fiercely loyal Rottweiler named Shadow. Everyone had some form of protection, either a hunting rifle or a shotgun, with a handgun as a backup. I was the only one who didn't have a handgun, relying solely on my rifle. We piled into 2 cars and drove for what felt like forever, eventually ending up about 25 or 30 miles away from the Canadian border in a forest that seemed to stretch on forever. I was really digging it because my home state didn't have anything like this. The trees were so massive and the air so crisp, it felt like we were the only people for 100 miles. We parked our cars on a tiny, unmarked dirt road, the kind only used by game wardens or border patrol, and hiked about 4 miles into the woods. By this time, the sun was already starting to dip below the tree line, and the forest grew dark with an unnatural speed. We knew we had to set up camp fast. 2 of the guys, Tom and Mark, along with Gus the Labrador, went out to gather firewood while the rest of us started setting up the tent. It was a huge 6 to 8 person tent, a fortress against the November cold that was already starting to bite. We got it set up in about 15 minutes, but the trio still hadn't returned. We started getting a little antsy. Greg shrugged and said, "Screw it," and we started a small fire with some branches we found around the site. Suddenly, we heard a crashing noise, like someone was running full tilt through the brush, heading straight for our camp. A few moments later, Tom and Mark burst through the tree line, gasping for air, their eyes wide with terror. Gus was nowhere to be seen. They started stammering, trying to explain what happened. They said they saw one of the other guys from our group, Tom, acting weird out in the woods. They had tried to get close to him, but every time they did, he would just move away. At one point, they said he just disappeared into thin air and then popped up less than 10 feet behind them. It was at that moment a sickening smell hit them, like rotten meat and soured milk, a scent that clung to the air and made their stomachs churn. They tried asking what was up, but he didn't answer. Then, without warning, he took off sprinting into the woods like Usain Bolt. Gus took off after him, barking its head off. Tom and Mark lost them both pretty quickly, and the smell started to disappear. Then, in the distance, they heard a weird screeching, followed by a loud dog's yelp. A moment later, the smell came back with a vengeance, this time accompanied by what they described as a mad, off-key giggling. They got the hell out of there, running back to camp. We were all pretty weirded out, but the guy they described seeing was standing right there, setting up the tents with us. We all vouched for him, confused by their story. We tried to rationalize it, thinking it was some kind of elaborate, messed up joke. I said as much, and that's when Greg yelled at me. "Well, where the heck is Gus then?" He had a point. The sun was now well on its way down, its last rays giving way to a bone-chilling twilight. We quickly built up the campfire and pulled out a few Coleman lanterns, their hissing light casting dancing shadows against the dense trees. All of us huddled around the fire, eating our MREs, our rifles and shotguns resting on our laps or propped up within easy reach. We were trying to eat and act normal, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The forest was no longer a beautiful escape. It felt like a hungry, living thing surrounding us. About 15 minutes after dark, the remaining dog, Shadow the Rottweiler, suddenly perked up. His ears swiveled back and forth, and a low, guttural growl began to rumble in his chest. It wasn't a playful growl, it was a sound of pure aggression, the kind that lets you know a beast is ready to fight. And then the smell hit us again. The two guys who had run back to camp were not wrong about that smell. It was an assault on the senses. I had smelled the rotten carcasses of deer that had been decaying for weeks. And they smelled fresher than this. This was something ancient and foul, a mixture of spoiled milk and death that made me gag. Then, the sounds began. We heard a weird groaning, a low, drawn-out noise that wasn't human. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of branches and leaves cracking, a deliberate, heavy footfall moving around the perimeter of our camp. It sounded like something was circling us, sizing us up. The noises intensified all around, and Shadow was going absolutely ballistic, straining at his leash and barking with a ferocity I had never heard before. Greg, the guy with the shotgun, stood up without a word. His face was a mask of grim determination. He raised his shotgun and fired off 3 rounds of buckshot randomly into the woods. The sound of the blasts was deafening, a desperate challenge to whatever was out there. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, and then an absolutely hellacious screech tore out of the woods, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and pain. It was the kind of scream that vibrates in your teeth and makes every hair on your body stand on end. The sound moved away from us, fast, and as it did, the smell dissipated. We were all shaking. We waited for about an hour in complete silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. The threat seemed to have passed, for now. We decided to try and get some sleep with 2 people on guard at all times. The first watch was me and another guy, Victor. Shadow was chilling with us by the fire, his head on his paws, but his ears were still alert. 2 hours passed without a single incident. The forest was silent again. The fear began to recede, replaced by an exhaustion that weighed on our bodies and minds. We woke up Greg and Tom for their turn, and within moments, I was asleep. I couldn't have been asleep for more than a little while when I was jolted awake by that same stomach-turning smell. It hit me like a physical blow, so vile and potent it brought a wave of nausea with it. At the same time, I heard Greg yelling his head off. My eyes flew open, and I scrambled out of my sleeping bag. The other guys were already awake, looking just as panicked as I felt. We all got up and headed outside into the cold night air. The fire was still burning low, but the lanterns were out, and the only light came from Greg's powerful spotlight, which he was sweeping frantically across the tree line. Tom, where the hell are you?" he was screaming into the darkness. I ran up to him, my heart pounding in my ears. "What happened, dude?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Greg's face was pale and drawn, a portrait of pure fear. He explained what had happened. They had been sitting there, trying to stay awake, when they heard one of the guys from our group, the one who had gone missing with Gus, calling out from the woods. But the voice was off, distorted, almost like a bad recording. Shadow, the Rottweiler, had immediately started to growl, a deep, resonant sound of warning. He rushed toward the spot where the sound had come from, and Tom, without thinking, followed him. The dog went through some bushes, and Tom, who was just a few feet behind, lost sight of him. He yelled for the dog, but there was no response, so he foolishly followed him deeper into the woods, leaving Greg alone at the fire. Greg had been yelling for him when he heard Tom begin to say something before he was cut off. He couldn't make out the words, just a strangled sound, and then silence. "I can't just leave them out there," Greg said, his voice cracking. And he was right. We had to go. So, we all pulled on our jackets, grabbed a flashlight or spotlight for each person, and checked our weapons one last time. As we set off into the pitch-black woods, the smell was everywhere. It was thick and cloying, making most of us feel rather nauseous, but we kept going. We found some of Tom's tracks, footprints in the soft dirt and broken branches where he had pushed through the brush. We followed them for about 10 minutes until we reached a clearing, and the trail just stopped. Literally. There were no more footprints after a certain point, and none leading back the way he had come. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. One of the guys at the back of the group, shining his light around, suddenly stopped and made this weird, choked noise. He then started yelling, his voice a mix of relief and pure anger. "You freaking jerk! I've been worried sick about you." The rest of the group walked over to look, and there he was, Tom, standing a good 20 feet away, but he was standing very, very wrong. His posture was stiff and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. It was unsettling. We stood there, a few feet from Tom, all of us shining our lights on him. "Are you okay, Tom, buddy? You need some help?" one of us asked. He just stood there, deadpan, his eyes black pools in the beam of our flashlights. He slowly, deliberately, nodded yes. The movement was so unnatural, so stiff, that a shiver went down my spine. A few of us walked over and put an arm around his shoulders to support him, trying to steer him back toward the camp. As we got closer, that same sickly sweet smell of decay hit us again, emanating directly from him. We realized he hadn't even been out there for a full day, yet he reeked like a corpse left in the sun. A few of the guys, trying to break the tension, made jokes about him needing a shower, but Tom didn't so much as crack a smile. He was completely silent, his expression blank. We decided to just get him back to camp, worried that maybe he had fallen and hit his head or something. When we got back, we tried to get him to lie down in the tent, but he just stood there, rigid, and refused to go inside. So we let him stay outside by the fire. He just stood there for a long time, staring into the flames. Two of our friends, exhausted, went to sleep in the tent, but Greg, Vic, and I decided to stay up and keep an eye on him. We pulled up our chairs and sat watching him, our guns resting on our laps. As we watched, he started doing these weird, jerky muscle spasm things every now and then, a creepy little twitch of his neck, a sudden tremor in his leg. It was like he was a puppet whose puppeteer was still getting the hang of the strings. We were all completely freaked out, but we didn't say anything, just exchanged nervous glances. We thought it might be something serious, a seizure or some kind of shock from his time out in the woods. He was mostly quiet and slow to respond to our questions. But then we gave him an MRE to eat, and his demeanor changed. He didn't eat at all, just tore into the packet and ravenously ate only the meat out of it, discarding the rest. We shrugged it off as him just being hungry. After he finished, he got up and started moving around the camp in that same jerky, unnatural way, looking towards the woods. He then turned to us and, in a flat, monotone voice, asked if we wanted to come into the woods with him to gather firewood. The request itself wasn't all that weird, but the timing was. It was pitch black outside, the only light coming from our fire and the few lanterns we had out. Plus, we had already collected a huge stack of firewood on the way back to the camp. It was a bizarre, irrational request. He didn't wait for an answer. He gave a jerky, shrug-like motion and then started walking weirdly, almost scuttling, into the darkness. At this point, we were on high alert, our hands on our rifles. We knew something was terribly wrong, and we didn't try to stop him. We just watched, frozen, as he disappeared into the blackness. Greg got up a few minutes later to step into the tent for something, so it was just me and Vic sitting by the fire, our eyes still fixed on the spot where Tom had disappeared. We didn't talk, there was nothing to say. Then, all at once, the smell returned. It hit my nose like a ton of bricks. The smell of putrid meat and curdled milk so intense, I actually gagged. It was a suffocating, almost physical presence. Then, I started hearing it, a sound I can only describe as a sort of gibbering and mad giggling coming from the direction Tom had gone. It was like a parody of human laughter, all high-pitched and maniacal, and it moved through the woods with an unsettling speed. I'd never been more freaked out in my entire life, and I could tell Vic was feeling the same. His eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored my own. Just then, Greg came out of the tent, freezing in the flat lap of the tent, and then starting to curse under his breath. The sound of his frantic cursing woke everyone up inside. When they were all awake and stumbling out, he counted everyone, his eyes scanning the group. As he counted, I could see his face turn a ghastly white. "What's up, dude?" I asked, my voice trembling. He just pointed a shaking finger at the tent. "While I was inside," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I did a quick body count." He looked at us, his eyes filled with a horror I will never forget. "There are 4 bodies inside." Someone, or something, had been chilling in our tent without us ever realizing that it had gotten in. The reality of it slammed into us, and we lost it hard at that moment. The gibbering and giggling from the woods got louder, and you could hear a bunch of nonsense babbling moving through the tree line like a chorus of madness. Then, we heard Tom's voice calling to us from the woods to come help him, but it was all off-key, and every now and then, he would start giggling that horrible, unhinged laugh. It was a perfect mimicry, but completely wrong. It was a lure, a trap. We didn't need to discuss it. We knew. We built the fire up and sat around it with all the lanterns on full, our weapons at hand, until the sun started coming up. As soon as there was enough light to see, we put the fire out, packed our stuff in record time, and made a beeline for the vehicles. We started hearing the giggling and the smell returned, and we just got out of there. Back at the cars, we found them covered in scratches. Most of the windows were smashed, and the seats were ripped to shreds, as if something had been trying to get in, or had already been inside. We just needed those babies to run, so we tossed the keys into the ignition and heard the sweet, glorious sound of an internal combustion engine starting up. We tossed our stuff in, got in, and sped out of there, never looking back. We didn't talk about it for a few months, and most of us didn't even admit that it happened. It was too insane, too terrifying to be real. But one of the guys with us later told me that he'd seen Tom at the edge of the woods, staring at us as we left. Apparently, he had this very creepy, wide grin on his face. And I believe him. I know that I'll never go camping that far away again, without at least a lot more people than 6. because I believe that was my first run-in with a skinwalker. The past 10 years feel like a blur, but the moment I got my first dog is still burned into my memory. It was a tiny toy poodle puppy, so small she could fit in my palm. She was way too cute, with big dark eyes that held a certain mischievous gleam, and also way too smart for her own good. It didn't take long for me to realize that her intelligence was less about obedience and more about pure, manipulative cunning. She quickly learned that little kids, sweet elderly ladies, and anyone who wore pink and sparkly stuff seemed to have a deep-seated, irrational love for puppies. She'd use this to her advantage, tilting her head just so, giving a single, pathetic whimper. And suddenly, they'd be offering her a piece of their food, a morsel from their hand. She knew how to play on human emotion, a trait I found both funny and a little unsettling. This wasn't an innocent animal. This was a tiny con artist in a fluffy, white coat. And I was her first mark. I should have seen the warning signs, but like everyone else, I was blinded by the innocence of her wagging tail. The day it happened started like any other. The low, familiar roar of the vacuum cleaner filled the house as I went through the motions, lost in the mundane rhythm of my weekend chores. I moved from room to room, the cord trailing behind me, the drone a comforting white noise that drowned out the world. I remember the momentary pause when I unplugged it, the sudden, oppressive silence that followed. It was in that deafening quiet that I realized something was wrong. My poodle, always underfoot, was nowhere to be seen. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I raced to the back door, and my heart sank as I saw the gate swinging ever so slightly in the breeze. She had escaped. The panic was instant and all-consuming. I threw on my shoes and started my search on foot, my voice hoarse from calling her name, a desperate sound swallowed by the quiet suburban streets. After a few blocks, a terrible thought seized me. What if she got out the moment the vacuum started? She could be miles away by now. The neighborhood, usually so full of life, felt eerily still. I abandoned my on-foot search, jumped into my car, and began to drive, each turn a new jolt of fear as I scanned the empty sidewalks. As I drove, my window rolled down. I kept shouting her name, a useless, frantic cry carried by the wind. My eyes scanned every lawn and corner, my mind replaying the moment the gate was open, a terrifying loop of what-ifs. And then I saw them, two small figures, a boy and a girl, no older than 5 or 6, playing on their front lawn. They were surrounded by a chaotic sprawl of brightly colored Barbies and miniature furniture. My heart leaped with a desperate, irrational hope. Maybe they had seen her. They heard me yelling and, with the innocent curiosity of children, abandoned their game and came running toward the car. They were so small, their faces full of genuine concern as they asked, "What kind of puppy did you lose?" My hand was already reaching for my phone to show them a picture. But in a sudden, jarring moment of clarity, a flash of pure, bone-deep fear shot through me. This was it. The very scenario every parent, every teacher, every horrifying news segment warned about. The stranger in the car, luring a child with a sympathetic story. I saw myself through their eyes, and the desperation that felt so real to me transformed into something sinister and predatory. My blood ran cold, and I choked out the only words that made any sense. "Go get your parents. I need to talk to them." One of the kids, A little girl with pigtails turned and ran toward the house, but the other, a small boy, stood his ground. He was so close to my car, his hands resting on the windowsill as he peered inside, his face full of innocent trust. "Do you have the puppy in there now?" he asked, his voice a soft, hopeful whisper. 1,000 alarm bells went off in my head. My only thought was a silent plea for his mother to hurry. I was frozen, trapped between the need to explain and the terrifying knowledge that any move I made would be seen as predatory. And then she came. The mother emerged from the house, and the moment she saw her child's hands on my car, a look of sheer, unadulterated panic swept over her face. She didn't run, she sprinted, her arms outstretched, her eyes wide with a protective fury. She scooped up the little boy, holding him tight as she glared at me, her body a shield between us. I tried to explain, to hand her my phone with the picture of my dog, to give her my number. I told her I'd lost my pet, my voice a shaky mess of desperation and shame. But she wasn't listening. Her fear had already written its own story. The disbelief was etched on her face. She didn't say a word, just clutched her children and backed away, her movements sharp and decisive as she retreated into the house. In that moment, I wasn't a desperate dog owner, I was the creep. I sat in my car, a mix of shame and despair churning in my stomach. The windows of the house remained dark and unforgiving. I drove home, the weight of the search now combined with the profound isolation of being so misunderstood. I just wanted to share that story because that day, I was the monster in the narrative, the very creep you hear about on the news. I had given up hope of finding her when my phone rang. It was a neighbor I barely knew, a kind older man who lived a few houses down. His voice was laced with confusion. "I think I found your dog," he said, and I braced myself for the worst. The reality, however, was far stranger than anything I could have imagined. He told me he went out to his chicken coop to collect eggs, and to his utter bewilderment, found a tiny white poodle curled up in one of the nests, fast asleep among a clutch of unhatched eggs. It got even more bizarre. The mother hen, a huge, feathery Rhode Island red, was perched right on top of her, having mistaken the fluffy poodle for one of her own. She had been sat on by the mama bird, as he so eloquently put it. When he went to retrieve the eggs, he was shocked to find not a newly hatched chick, but a very sleepy, very tail-wagging poodle. Hey, Joel. I've been a big fan for a while now, and thankfully, I've never had anything happen to me that might necessitate the writing of a scary story. But then recently, I asked my mom about an unusual memory I had from my childhood, which I then found out was just the tip of the iceberg. My version of the story goes something like this. This happened when I was 8 years old. So Thanksgiving 1993. My family and I drove way across the state to spend the night with my aunt and uncle on my mom's side. I was always close with my cousins on that side of the family, and my mom and her sister were really close too. So we tended to spend a lot of holidays together. The drive over to their place was a blur of backseat games and fighting over the radio, the kind of mundane chaos that defines every family road trip. I remember arriving at their house, a cozy 2-story with a big porch, and playing with my cousins for what felt like hours, a whirlwind of hide and seek and wrestling on the living room carpet. Then, we all sat down to dinner after being summoned by my mom and aunt. The house filled with the sounds of happy chatter and the delicious smells of roasted turkey and all the trimmings. We loaded up our plates, and the last thing I remember is my mom and my aunt telling us that we were going to have dinner in the upstairs bedrooms. I have this distinct recollection of not wanting to eat my food upstairs because kids hate change, and even at 8 years old, the sanctity of the dinner table was a big deal. But then my mom said something that instantly changed my mind. Anyone who eats their turkey upstairs gets to watch the Mighty Ducks on the big TV in the mommy and daddy bedroom. And that was all that needed to be said. We were all up in her bedroom before we could say, "Attack the puck." It was like a dream Thanksgiving. My mom laid out a big blanket for us, put all our plates down on it, and we just sat there perfectly content, watching our hero, Gordon Bombay, turn a bunch of misfits into champions. Mom stayed with us, but she didn't need anything. Whenever we needed to use the bathroom, she would walk us there and back, a quiet, watchful presence. But then, anytime we wanted to go downstairs for any reason, to grab another roll or a glass of water, she'd tell us to wait where we were. A minute later, she'd return with whatever it was we wanted. At the time, I just thought it was her being extra caring, wanting to make sure we were comfortable and not missing a minute of the movie. The way I remembered it, it was the best Thanksgiving ever. We got to eat dessert up there too, pumpkin pie and whipped cream, a sweet-tasting rebellion against the usual rules. We watched a whole bunch of other movies after that, and then we all fell asleep in my aunt and uncle's bed before driving back home sometime the next morning. That's where my memory of the event ends. For the longest time, I remembered nothing except how cool it was to be able to watch the Mighty Ducks while eating my turkey. I somehow knew it was an exception. We asked if we could do the same thing in the years that followed, and were always told no. The reason was never explained, but we accepted it. It was a once-in-a-lifetime treat, and we were lucky to have had it. But then, last year, I just so happened to ask my dad about that Thanksgiving and why. Just for 1 year, we got to eat in front of the TV. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I had stumbled onto something. I remember he gave me this look, and it was one that I didn't recognize. I feel like we were all used to seeing our dads with like 3 basic facial expressions. The first is that "I'm not mad right now, but I'm ready for something" kind of look. The second being straight up mad. And the third being that "my sports team just won a game" kind of smile. But that day, my dad gave me this look that I could only interpret as fear. It was a primal, gut-wrenching expression that sent a shiver down my spine. Whatever the answer to my question was, it wasn't some half-buried memory made fuzzy by too many blue ribbons or too much time. It was something he remembered very well, and was something that frightened him still. He let out a big sigh and told me, "Don't tell your mom I told you this," and then went into the grown-ups version of events. A chilling narrative that peeled back the layers of my childhood innocence to reveal the terrifying truth hidden just beneath the surface. So everything I told you to start with still stands. And by that, I mean everything was going fine until we sat down to dinner. The kids were at our small table right next to the big one where the adults sat, all of us chattering away about our day. It was the picture of a perfect family dinner. Then, as we were eating, the phone started to ring. My uncle got up to answer the call, and it was a man asking for my aunt. He called her to the phone and then sat back down to eat, not thinking anything of it. A minute or two later, my aunt came back in, but the change in her was immediate and unsettling. The lively energy she had just a moment ago was gone. She was quiet, and she wasn't touching her food. Her eyes seemed to be staring into the middle distance, as if she were replaying some terrible memory in her mind. My uncle, ever the gentle and caring husband, asked her what was wrong, but she just gave him a faint, forced smile and told him she was fine. It was just someone from work calling, or some other vague excuse that got him to drop it. even though he clearly knew something was off. Then, another minute or two went by, and the grown-ups started seeing a car's headlights turn into my aunt and uncle's long, winding driveway. They weren't expecting any other guests, but it was Thanksgiving, so it wasn't out of the question that someone might stop over unexpectedly. But instead of just acting curious like the rest of the grown-ups, my dad said that he watched the color drain from my aunt's face. It wasn't a slow fade, it was a sudden, horrifying pallor, as if she'd just seen a ghost. Her hands began to tremble. My uncle was halfway to getting up from his seat to see who it was when my dad said my aunt grabbed him by the arm, her fingers digging in with a surprising, desperate strength, and said 3 hushed words that had the color draining from his face too. "Get your gun." The world seemed to stop. My mom and dad looked at each other, their minds reeling, obviously wanting to know what the hell was happening. There was no time to really explain. All my aunt told them was that we might all be in a lot of danger. At that point, my mom started gathering us kids up and taking us upstairs. We'd all been sitting at the kids' table at the time, and although it was right there next to the adults' table, I don't remember anything except the moment my mom told me to go upstairs. It was as if a mental fog descended, erasing the images and sounds of the chaos around us. It's a psychological defense mechanism, I've learned, one that a child's mind uses to protect itself from overwhelming trauma. My mom, in that moment, was the living embodiment of that protection. She stayed upstairs with us, creating a fortress of normalcy, making sure that we didn't see anything or hear anything of what happened next. She was our guardian angel, shielding us from a horror we couldn't even begin to comprehend. Meanwhile, my uncle and my dad and aunt went to see who'd showed up unexpectedly. Having listened to the advice of my aunt, my uncle had his .45 ready to go, the cold metal a heavy promise in his hand. My dad said that even with the gun, my uncle had no idea who was out there or why my aunt was so scared, and all the unanswered questions had him just as scared as she was. But still, he did what he had to and walked outside with his gun ready to go. According to my dad, they walked out onto the porch, and they couldn't see anything right away because the guy's headlights were shining bright and just blinding them. A common tactic for people with malicious intent. They take a few steps off the porch and their security light, a motion-activated beacon of safety, lit up the stranger's car. My dad said he could see the guy standing behind his open trunk, but he couldn't see his face at all at first, just a dark silhouette against the car's interior light. Meanwhile, my uncle was marching towards the guy, his voice low and firm, asking him to identify himself. And then the guy steps out from behind his car, holding his own gun. My aunt screamed, then ran back inside. But my dad said that he was frozen, the adrenaline locking his muscles in place. He knew that if this random, gun-toting stranger shot my uncle, he'd have to try and rush him from the side, because there was no way he was going to let some maniac gun into his house where his kids were upstairs. It's a primal calculation, a parent's instinct to protect their child at all costs. My dad also said that right about the same time he saw the gun, he noticed something about the guy holding it. He was drunk as a skunk. He didn't so much as step out from behind the car as stumble out from behind it. A grotesque parody of a menacing figure. And as my uncle approached him, the guy looked like he had no idea how to use the gun he was holding. He was fumbling with it, his movements slow and clumsy. My uncle raised his own and kept telling him, "You point that thing at me and I'll kill you." And by some miracle, the stranger either couldn't load the thing properly or couldn't get a good grip on the slide, because my uncle made it all the way over to him and hit him with a vicious right hook before he could even look up. Dad said it was a nasty hit, too, but even so, he'd never been so relieved in his entire life. After that, My dad rushed him, disarmed the stranger for good. Then he and my uncle basically sat on the guy until the cop showed up. I say sat on the guy, more like sat with him, because when he woke up from being knocked out, he had next to no idea where he was, and was so out of it that he didn't even try to get up until we saw the lights of the sheriff's deputies approaching my aunt and uncle's house. The deputies cuffed the guy, then took him away. And all the while, me and my cousins are up in the back bedroom completely none the wiser that any of this was happening. Like I already said, Mom stayed with us until bedtime, and I remember my aunt and uncle coming in to say goodnight too. Now looking back on it, they were as cool and calm as anything. Not even a hint of what had just unfolded downstairs. It was an incredible performance of parental calm under pressure, a testament to their strength and their love for us. But after we went to sleep, it was a different story. After we went to sleep, it was a different story. My aunt, sitting with my mom and dad and uncle, finally revealed the truth. A dark and harrowing secret she'd carried for years. For the very first time, she told them the story of why she'd packed up and moved away from her home city. It was all because of some psycho that she'd made the mistake of getting hitched to. She described him not as a brute, but as a manipulator. He didn't hit her, he wasn't a violent man, which made sense after the sorry display he'd made with the pistol. But he found other, more insidious ways to make her life absolutely terrible. He was an architect of psychological control, a master of isolating his victims. At first, it was subtle. She didn't need to work because he could take care of her, a common lie used to sever a woman's financial independence. She didn't need her own checking accounts, because why would she? He was the provider. My aunt was too naive to realize that when her ex-husband turned bad, not having her own money would mean that she was basically stranded, a prisoner in her own home. The control escalated, becoming crueler and more bizarre. He'd take the phone out of the house, a classic move to cut off communication with the outside world. He'd throw all the food out, one at a time, to make her feel powerless. One night, he left her alone in the house, a house now devoid of food and any means of communication. She had to beg on the street for the payphone money to call my grandma to come rescue her. She was so ashamed of having gotten into that situation, of having been so stupid, as she put it, that she swore my grandma to secrecy. It was a secret that my grandma took to her grave with her, a silent pact of protection and shame. Sometime after, my aunt moved to Chicago to be closer to my sister, met my uncle, and the rest is history. She thought that she'd left that whole sad chapter of her life behind. 10 years had passed since she'd heard from him, and she had no idea if her ex was dead or alive. It was a state of limbo, a constant low-level anxiety she lived with every day. Not until he showed up at her house early on that Thanksgiving evening. When he'd called earlier, he'd used a fake name, an alias from her past, a name only he would have known to ask for her by. He was testing the waters, confirming she was there. And when he showed up, he wasn't just there to confront her. The man who had stumbled out of the car, reeking of alcohol and rage, had a gun and 2 gallons of gas in his trunk. He hadn't come for an argument. He hadn't come for an apology. His plan, his twisted, monstrous plan, was to shoot us all and then burn the house down. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. A real-life boogeyman in their driveway with a gallon of gas in each hand, ready to burn their happy family and life to the ground. The guy ended up going to prison. Not for as long as anyone would have liked him to, but if he steps foot back in the town my aunt and uncle live in, not Chicago by the way, then he'll go straight back to prison, no questions asked. Obviously, 30 years have gone by, and my parents and aunt and uncle are all in their 70s by now. That means that her ex is going to be around that age too. Hopefully, He somehow found a way to make peace with the whole thing, and he's not going to try and reach out again. But that's the thing that actually frightens me about this whole story. It's not actually over yet. Everyone just kind of assumes that he's not going to show up again, mostly on account of how old he'll be. But from where I'm standing, it looks a lot more like hope than assumption. They're all just hoping this guy isn't going to show up again. And the idea that there's some impending family tragedy on the horizon, that a man with a singular, murderous focus could reappear at any moment, it makes me feel like there's a blade hanging over my neck just waiting to drop at any time. I'm scared. What my aunt went through twice will only really ever be over when her ex is dead. At least I hope so, because God knows I don't want it to end with anyone else dying except him. Thanksgiving is coming up, and I know you sometimes make videos based on whatever holidays are on the horizon, so I wanted to send my story in about that time of the year. I had a great childhood, and I know that in this age of people wearing their traumas on their sleeve, that's not a very cool thing to admit, but it's true. My world felt perfect, a solid, unshakable foundation built on the bedrock of normalcy. I don't have any issues with my mom or dad, who are still together after 40+ years of marriage. We were a quiet, stable unit, and our house felt less like a building and more like a fortress against the chaos of the outside world. I was never bullied at school, and unlike my two best friends growing up, who had liver problems and diabetes respectively, I never had any chronic medical issues to deal with. And I used to think that I was just lucky. Everyone seemed to have some messed up thing going on in their family, be it a divorce, a sibling, or parent with drug or alcohol problems, anything that meant they were broody and world-weary by the time we hit high school. I saw it in their eyes, the hollowed-out look of someone who had seen too much, too soon. But I didn't, and on top of that, I couldn't exactly see anything on the horizon either. The future, as far as I was concerned, was just an extension of the tranquil present. It was a comforting, perhaps naive, belief that I would be spared the kind of ugly mess that seemed to follow everyone else. But during Thanksgiving of 2005, when I was 15 years old, I found out that everything in my family wasn't exactly perfect either. The quiet fortress had a hidden door, and that night, it was about to be flung open. The central figure in this story, besides me, is my Uncle Tony. He was almost 20 years younger than my dad. My dad was an only child all through his teenage years. He grew up in the quiet solitude of his own room and was well into his 20s and serving in the Marine Corps when he got the news that his little brother was on the way. My grandparents always said my uncle was an unexpected blessing, which I guess is the polite, churchy way of saying he was an accident. And with him being the baby of the family, he was doted on and spoiled like it was nobody's business. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and a sharp contrast to my father, the Marine who valued discipline, order, and practicality. This dynamic ended with my dad and uncle being not just worlds apart in terms of age, but also worlds apart in terms of personality. My dad's time in the military wasn't a passing phase. It had forged him into a man who was quietly, but unshakably, in command. He wasn't a hard man in a cruel way, but there was a certain rigidness to his character that had stuck with him. My uncle, on the other hand, was a struggling musician, then a struggling artist, and then a struggling writer, all because my grandparents blew so much hot air up his butt that he thought ambition could just trump talent. He was the embodiment of the bohemian dream, a man who saw the world as a canvas rather than a field to be worked. I always thought he was a cool guy, and I could never understand why my dad gave him such a hard time. My father's disapproval wasn't a yelling match or an argument. It was a quiet, cold distance. A barely there sigh or a glance that spoke volumes. But to me, my uncle always seemed so laid back and chilled out. He was the one I could talk to about all the stuff my dad found boring or had no time for: movies, music, and the absurdities of life. I was always pleased to see him whenever he visited, and he and my dad never argued in front of me, which I appreciate looking back on, at least until the Thanksgiving I'm about to tell you about. It was Thanksgiving 2005. One night we were having dinner, and my dad tells my mom that my uncle was bringing his girlfriend over for the holiday. I remember being excited to meet her. After all, anyone dating my uncle must be as cool as him, right? Mom and Dad seemed kind of nervous, emphasis on kind of, but I put it down to them never having met her prior to a big family occasion. Maybe a week or two later, my uncle shows up for Thanksgiving and starts introducing his girlfriend to the whole family. She was very attractive, I'll say that much, but she was definitely out of place with her leather jacket and tattoos, the kind of edgy, streetwise look that stood in stark contrast to the conservative suburban atmosphere of our house. It was like she was a character from a different movie, a film noir protagonist dropped into a heartwarming holiday special. Now, that being said, my family were as friendly as ever and tried their best to make her feel welcome. They were good at that, at putting on a pleasant face even when something felt off. Dad made a toast, we ate dinner, and then everyone kind of went their separate ways to do the after stuff. The men went to watch sports highlights in the living room. The women had coffee around the breakfast nook in the kitchen, and the younger kids played among themselves. But me? I went upstairs to my bedroom to play video games. I can't remember how long I played for, but it was mid-evening when I went downstairs to grab a soda, so maybe like 7:30 or 8 o'clock. I walked into the kitchen, and right by the refrigerator was the door to the garage. I opened the fridge, grabbed a soda, then after I closed it and started walking out of the kitchen, I heard something coming from the garage. To my knowledge, everyone was either sitting around the TV or playing bridge in the dining room. There was no one left in the kitchen, and there definitely shouldn't have been anyone in the garage. So obviously the question was, who was in there and why? It could have easily been a raccoon, I guess. But my biggest fear, the one that had me reaching for the door to take a peek outside, was the idea that someone had broken into our garage. The same garage that had direct access to a house full of totally unsuspecting people and myself. I remember reaching for the door handle real slow, the metallic touch cold against my palm, then pulling it open real fast. I scanned the interior. The garage was dark except for the single, pale yellow light from a bare bulb hanging overhead. Something caught my eye right away. It was my uncle's girlfriend. Her eyes just looked wrong. There was blood coming out of her nose and mouth, and at first I thought my uncle was trying to help her. My mind, in that split second of confusion, tried to create a logical, innocent explanation. Maybe she fell. Maybe she got a bloody nose. But then, right there with me watching, he hits her. And he hit her so hard that her head just jerked back in this weird ragdoll kind of way that I can still remember clear as day. Even all these years later, it was a sickening, unnatural motion, like a mannequin being shoved. And the second he did, the truth slammed into me. A visceral, horrifying blow. I slammed the door closed, the sound a sharp crack in the silence, and ran into the TV room. I managed to get the attention of everyone there by just pointing towards the kitchen and saying, "Uncle Tony in the garage." His name isn't actually Tony, by the way. I just don't know how to describe the moment without dropping a name. Everyone ran to the garage. The cops were called, and within maybe 10 or 15 minutes, what had once been a nice family atmosphere had turned into total chaos, which spilled out into the streets and ended with my uncle in a cop car and his girl in an ambulance. I didn't get to see all that much before my mom and dad screamed at me to get up to my room. They were so angry that I thought they were mad at me for a while, and it was a moment of deep confusion. The world was still spinning from what I had just seen, and then the people who were supposed to be my safe harbor were screaming at me to go away. It felt like I had done something wrong, that my simple act of discovery was a transgression. But then, after the chaos had died down and the sirens faded into the night, they explained something to me that I don't think childless people are even capable of conceiving. So much of what a parent does bears no other purpose than to protect their children. Sometimes a parent can come across as a total jerk, just a soulless, joyless husk that wants nothing more than to suck all the happiness out of their kid's life. I know there are times when parents overstep the line and genuinely are cruel and abusive to their kids, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the things that feel like punishments or restrictions that are actually nothing but manifestations of love and protection. And that's pretty much the reason my mom and dad shielded me from the truth about Uncle Tony. They didn't want to cut him off or have me resenting them for not allowing us to have a relationship. So they went about this difficult balancing act of allowing him to visit me without filling my head about the stuff he was doing in his life. Stuff like doing drugs, committing petty financial crimes, stealing from his own parents, and, as I saw with my own eyes, being a complete piece of human garbage and how he chose to treat the women in his life. They were trying to preserve my innocence, to give me the kind of carefree childhood I was so lucky to have, even if it meant lying by omission. I was a child, and they knew I wasn't equipped to handle the ugly truth of a family member's dark side. Which reminds me, like I said, Uncle Tony, again, not his real name, got picked up by the cops after my dad and some neighbors basically beat the crap out of him and pinned him down in our driveway. They were enraged, not just by what he had done, but by the violation of our home and the shattering of our family's peace. But his girlfriend, she had to stay in the hospital overnight. My uncle had beaten her pretty bad, and I think the doctors were scared that she had a concussion, but all she had was a broken nose and a busted lip. I guess Mom and Dad paid her hospital bills, a quiet act of atonement for the monster in our family tree. Mom went to visit her sometime after, and I'm guessing it was to ask about her pressing charges. To this day, I still don't know for sure if my mom went over to talk her into it, and she's always claimed that all she said was something like, "We'll support you no matter what your decision is," and that the girl went ahead and pressed charges all of her own free will. I'm not saying that's impossible, but I've heard way too many stories about battered wives and girlfriends being too afraid to talk to the cops for years before they suddenly snap and decide to do something themselves. Maybe that was the case with my uncle and his girlfriend. Or maybe my mom knew that unless someone stepped in and encouraged her to do the right thing, the same pattern of misery and violence would just go on and on until someone either died or got sent to jail. Just to be clear, that's entirely speculation on my part, and I guess I'll take my mom's word for it that she didn't intervene or interfere. But either way, it went to court, and my uncle pled no contest. Seeing as there were a ton of witnesses against him, he ended up doing 3 years of a 6-year sentence, at which point my parents totally cut him off. And by that time, I was completely okay with him doing that, as I had absolutely no desire to see my Uncle Tony ever again. Now, I know it might sound kind of messed up, but for the first few days after it happened, I wasn't angry or horrified or appalled at what my uncle did. I was heartbroken. It was a bizarre, unexpected emotional state. I couldn't believe someone that I looked up to so much was capable of doing something just so awful. It felt like a part of my own identity, a cherished memory, had been ripped out and stomped on. I just couldn't make sense of it. In my mind, there had to be some kind of terrible misunderstanding. I still haven't really forgiven myself for thinking this, but I couldn't help but think this girl had done something to deserve it. I guess. Was she trying to steal something? Had he caught her doing drugs? There had to be some logical reason why my laid-back, incredibly cool uncle, the man I saw as a symbol of artistic freedom and easygoing charm, would do something so terrible. Spoilers, there wasn't a reason. At least nothing that could possibly justify putting his hands on her in the way that he did. And I had to hear the whole thing from my mom following her visit to the still recovering and now ex-girlfriend to really understand what had happened. One of the things I wondered in the days after was why his girlfriend hadn't screamed. If they were having a fight or whatever, then how had it gone from near silence to physical violence without any kind of escalation in volume? That was just one of the reasons why I very naively thought that there must have been something more to the story, right up until my mom told me the following. She hadn't asked my uncle's ex the same question, not directly anyway. It just came out during my mom's retelling of her visit. My uncle's ex didn't scream when he started hitting her because she had learned that if she did, he'd only hit her harder. That single detail, that one piece of information, wasn't just a simple statement of fact. It was a window into a secret, private hell that had been going on for who knows how long, a terror so profound that it had taught a human being to remain silent in the face of brutal violence. This one little detail did two things for me. Number one, it gave me an idea of just how long the abuse had been going on for. This wasn't a one-time thing, a sudden, inexplicable burst of violence. This was a learned behavior, a pattern of cruelty that had been established over a long, dark period. And number two, it made me hate my uncle. I mean, really, truly hate him. There was and is something so sickeningly sadistic about that one little detail, and once I had it in my head, there was no coming back from it. The idol I had built in my mind was shattered, and in its place was the face of a monster. That was the uncle I didn't know I had. That was the version of my uncle that my parents tried to shield me from. I guess that's maybe an overdone concept with some of the stories that you probably get sent here. As in the old, I thought they were sweet, but they were actually a monster trope. But I also understand why they don't ever really get old either. That's something a lot of people go through in their lives, realizing that sometimes things aren't quite what they seem. But a lot of my school friends got that lesson way early, whereas I was well into my teenage years when I realized that sometimes you think you know someone, when really, you don't know them at all. I was a freshly graduated high school student. On my way to college, during my senior year, I had a job working for my grandfather as a farmhand, more or less a farm manager. He would give me instructions on what to do on the farm without him being there, most commonly feeding the cows. It was early November. The air was sharp, and the sun was already setting by the time my shift began. After school, I had baseball practice from 3:25 to 5:30, and by the time I arrived at the farm, the world was steeped in twilight. The cows were my responsibility, and their hunger was my clock. One day, I'd gotten dressed and filled up the buckets with feed, ready to get to work. I had just finished feeding the first group of cows when I realized I didn't have a key to the gate of the other farm. Frustrated and cold, I was forced to pick up 2 buckets at a time and walk them all the way from the fence to the feed trough, a good 40-yard walk. It was a tedious task, and I could feel my frustration building with every step. To keep my spirits up, I started to whistle, no real tune or pattern, just a series of random notes I made up as I went. When I came back and put the last buckets in the bed of the truck, I heard it. A faint, low whistle from the neighboring property. It sounded so close. I froze for a moment, my mind racing. No one lives anywhere near that property. It's all abandoned farmland and dense woods. My logical mind quickly took over. It must be a mockingbird, I told myself, trying to rationalize the impossible. I shook it off and went on with my life. But the image of that dark, silent property across the fence stuck in my mind. For the next couple of days, I was too uneasy to whistle, but the sound continued. Each evening, as I went about my chores, the same mysterious notes would drift over the property line. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it got clearer and clearer. The first time, it had been so faint I almost missed it over the crunch of my boots on the gravel. But within a few days, it sounded like a regular person whistling, as if they were standing just across the fence. It wasn't just clearer, it was also louder. It was like something was learning, adapting, and growing more confident. The more it happened, the more I became accustomed to it. The initial fear was replaced by a strange mix of curiosity and dread. It became part of my evening routine, the setting sun, the lowing of the cattle, and the unsettling whistle from the abandoned farm. I found myself half expecting it, listening for it as I walked to and from my truck. It was a bizarre, silent conversation between me and some unknown entity. I'd finished my work, my mind on the chores, but a part of me was always waiting for that familiar, eerie tune. My bizarre routine continued until one day, the whistling didn't come. The silence was more unnerving than the sound had ever been. I felt a strange pang of disappointment, as if a part of my evening ritual was missing. This time, I'd remembered the key to the other farm. I walked up to the rusted gate and started fiddling with my keys, but my gloved hands fumbled, and the whole ring slipped from my grasp, falling into the tall, damp grass. Damn it, I muttered, my voice a low growl of frustration. I squatted down and began to search for them, my fingers combing through the cold, wet blades. That's when I heard it, a very faint sound coming from the other property. It wasn't a whistle this time, but a low groan or a gurgle, like something struggling to breathe. It was getting louder, slowly but surely. At this point, I wasn't scared. I was just incredibly curious. What on earth was going on over there? Was it an injured animal? A lost hiker? I left my truck parked across from the property, walked a few feet down the road, and hopped the fence. The land in there goes straight uphill and is heavily wooded all throughout. I knew I was making a mistake, but my curiosity was a powerful force. As I started my ascent, the gurgling sound continued, still distant but pulling me forward. Looking back now, I can see so many mistakes I made that could have gotten me hurt, but in that moment, all I could think about was finding the source of the sound. As I walked up the hill, the gurgle would occasionally break the stillness of the woods. It was far up, but I was determined. I felt like a character in a bad movie, but I had to know. The higher I went, the more dense the trees became, and the darker the woods felt. A new sensation began to hit me, a foul smell, a weird mixture of something like garbage and wet dog, or maybe something even worse. It was thick in the air, a physical presence that made my stomach turn. I was about to crest the hill when I heard it again. Damn it! It wasn't a gurgle this time, but a very dry, low, and quite distorted voice. It came from just a couple of yards in front of me, a couple of yards in the darkness. It sounded like an old man with a 60-year smoking habit, saying the words very slowly, as if they didn't know English. I automatically thought someone was on our property, and a wave of anger and paranoia washed over me. I started to move slower, trying to be as quiet as possible. I didn't want this guy to hear me before I could see them. I kept going, stopping and listening when I heard another sound. Damn it. Damn. Damn it. Damn it. This time, the guy was saying it normally, not long and drawn out in that eerie way. I sat down on a log, my heart pounding, trying to figure out what I should do. He kept saying it over and over, and I noticed his tone was getting higher and his inflection was changing. And then it hit me. This guy wasn't just repeating a word, he was perfectly mimicking me. My tone, my inflection, my frustration, literally everything. He even mimicked the way I said it when I was angry. A cold, heavy feeling of terror settled in my gut. What I was dealing with wasn't just some old squatter. It was something that could listen, learn, and copy. Anger and fear mixed in my chest, a volatile cocktail of emotions. I got up from the log and began to creep toward the top of the hill, my phone's flashlight held in front of me like a flimsy shield. "Hey, this is private property," I yelled, my voice shaking with a mix of bravado and pure terror. I was cut off mid-sentence as I came over the hill. The light barely illuminated a naked figure, squatting just a couple of yards in front of me. His eyes were huge, reflecting the faint glow of my flashlight like two polished marbles. I automatically felt that something was horribly wrong. This wasn't a regular person. His neck was unnaturally long, and as I came over the hill, he winched it, twisting his head to look at me without moving his body. It was a jerky, inhuman motion, like a broken animatronic. His head was large and slender, and his eyes were far too big. He was squatted in a bizarre, almost ballerina-like pose. I looked at his body. It was impossibly skinny, his ribs showing through the pale, taut skin like a cage. There was a terrifying silence between us, and like a robot, the creature turned in the rustling leaves and slowly stood, its hands next to its sides. It was far too tall to be a person, stretching upward into the darkness. "Damn it," it said, in my voice, my exact tone, my frustration, my fear. Firstly, I have to be completely honest with you. This isn't a typical horror story full of screaming monsters or masked killers. The horror in this is a lot more subtle, a lot more real, and for me, a lot more unsettling. It all started after a period in my life that, frankly, I don't like to talk about. Let's just say I was in a bad place and I needed to get away from everything I knew. The city, the people, the routine that had become a prison. My parents, bless their hearts, understood and offered me their little vacation cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was a place we used to go to for summer getaways, but it hadn't been used in years. When I arrived, the place was in a real sorry state. Dust covered everything, cobwebs hung from the rafters like funeral drapery, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and neglect. It was more of a project than a refuge, but that was exactly what I needed. Cleaning it gave me something to keep me occupied, a tangible task to keep my mind from wandering into darker corners. The whole process had a therapeutic quality to it. I was making a house a home again, and with every swipe of a dust rag and every new coat of paint, I felt a little bit of my old self returning. I ended up staying there for almost 4 months, and while the solitude was healing, it was also profoundly lonely. I missed the simple noise of people, the easy conversation, the warmth of company. I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss my family, and I was just desperate for some company all around. I was in no position to turn them down when my mom and dad suggested driving up for Thanksgiving. They promised to bring turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sandwiches. Just the idea of it was enough to make my stomach rumble and my heart feel a little lighter. They traveled up, and we had a nice, quiet afternoon just hanging out, catching up, and enjoying the simple peace of the cabin. We went to bed at a pretty early hour, exhausted from the day, and woke up just as early, the air crisp and cold. I made us some eggs. They packed up their things, but before they left, my parents asked if I wanted to go for a walk. It had been a while since they'd visited the cabin, so they figured it would be nice to just sort of reacquaint themselves with some of the old trails that we used to walk during our childhood vacations. I remember the old route because it led up to this big iron bridge that ran high above a shallow stream. Walking across it always used to freak me out as a kid because looking through the railings down into the stream gave me the willies in a big way. It wasn't a fear of heights, not really. It was more a fear of what might be lurking in the dark shadows of the water, a feeling that something ancient was watching us from below. But the more we walked there on our trips, the less freaked out I got, and eventually it became one of my favorite spots whenever we visited the cabin. It was a perfect, quiet, and nostalgic way to say goodbye to them before they headed back to the city. So we got to going on our walk along those winding trails that went up and up until we reached the iron footbridge. We didn't talk very loudly. We were just enjoying the stillness of the forest. The air was cool and crisp, a real treat for the senses. I remember the smell of damp earth and pine needles, the rustle of leaves under our boots, and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only people left on Earth. But as we got closer to the bridge, something shifted. The forest went completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no sound at all. It was an unnatural quiet, the kind that makes the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. We just kept walking, not saying anything, maybe because we all felt it. That strange, heavy stillness hung in the air, a blanket of dread that settled over us the closer we got to the bridge. It was unsettling, to say the least. It was as if we had stepped through some invisible threshold and entered a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling lingered, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. And then we saw him. We got to going on our walk along those winding trails that went up and up until we reached the iron footbridge. We also weren't talking very loudly. We were just enjoying the stillness of the forest. The air was cool and crisp, a real treat for the senses. I remember the smell of damp earth and pine needles, the rustle of leaves under our boots, and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only people left on Earth. But as we got closer to the bridge, something shifted. The forest went completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no sound at all. It was an unnatural quiet, the kind that makes the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. We just kept walking, not saying anything, maybe because we all felt it. That strange, heavy stillness hung in the air, a blanket of dread that settled over us the closer we got to the bridge. It was unsettling, to say the least. It was as if we had stepped through some invisible threshold and entered a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling lingered, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. And then, when we got there, we saw this other guy standing by the railings, looking over the edge. There are plenty of other cabins in the area, so I just figured this guy was doing the same thing we were, taking a little walk, maybe before or after dinner, just to clear his head and digest his turkey. We didn't call out to him or anything. I guess I figured that we'd just give him a friendly nod if we made eye contact while walking across the bridge. We also weren't talking very loudly. We were just enjoying the stillness of the forest. I guess that had us talking in library voices or something. Go figure. Anyway, my point is, this guy didn't see or hear us until we were almost right up on the bridge. When he did, he got startled and had this sort of bewildered, "You saw me" expression that I found really confusing at first. It was a look of pure, gut-wrenching shock. Not at the fact that he was seen, but at who he was seeing. His eyes, wide and hollow, seemed to look right through us, as if he was seeing something else entirely, something that terrified him. That's when I knew something was off. The way his body language shifted, not in surprise, but in a kind of frantic, resigned terror, made a chilling amount of sense the second after. The second after the guy saw us, he didn't jump. He just vanished. My mom let out this really shocked gasp while my dad went to grab her, like he was trying to protect her from something that couldn't actually do her any physical harm. Me, on the other hand, I just ran forward towards where the guy had been standing. I don't really know what I was thinking, and to be honest, I don't really know if I was really thinking at all. I guess it was just some gut reaction to try and understand what had just happened. But he was in free fall by the time I even stepped foot onto the bridge. Or at least that's what it looked like. I peered through the rusted railings, my eyes scanning the shallow stream below. There was nothing. No body. No splash. No sign that anyone had ever been there. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole, a fleeting apparition that had never truly existed. That's when I heard it. A sound, low and gurgling, like a big bullfrog, but it wasn't a sound of nature. It was a croaking whisper, and it seemed to be calling out to me from the dark, shadowy water. It only happened 1 or 2 times, but that was enough. The sound was so deeply wrong, so unnatural, that I instinctively backed away from the railing, a chilling dread seeping into my bones. I didn't want to get any closer. I ran back towards my parents, and without a single word, we all turned and headed back towards the cabin, leaving the haunted silence of the bridge behind us. We didn't talk much on the way back to the cabin. The 3 of us were too shaken, too confused. My parents had seen the same thing I had, that impossible disappearance, but no one had an explanation. Once we were safely inside, with the doors locked and the fire roaring in the hearth, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light? A hallucination brought on by the cold in our imaginations? We all knew that wasn't true. We had seen what we had seen. The very next day, I moved out of the cabin, a month earlier than planned. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face, a look of terror that wasn't directed at me, but at something unseen. And the sound. That gurgling whisper from the creek below. It echoed in my mind for weeks. The curiosity got the better of me, and I started doing some research online about the area. I wasn't surprised to find that the Iron Bridge had a dark reputation. Local lore spoke of the Bridge of the Lost, a place where people who were once consumed by a deep sadness would sometimes be seen standing, only to vanish into the thin air. The stories claimed that they were not ghosts, not in the traditional sense, but rather echoes of souls that had been trapped between worlds, bound to the place of their final despair. I realized then that what I had seen wasn't a malicious spirit, but something far more tragic. It was a fragment of a lost soul, forever trapped, repeating its final moments for anyone unfortunate enough to witness it. That realization was both terrifying and incredibly sad. I haven't been back to the cabin since. And while I do believe in ghosts now, I don't believe in the sheet-wearing, chain-rattling kind. I believe that people can be haunted by the dead, not by some sort of apparition, but by the echoes they leave behind.